On the morning of January 13th, 2010, two twin girls nicknamed Taz and Jazz stood at the kitchen counter in their home in Conyers, Georgia, writing notes back and forth to each other inside of a little notebook, laughing the whole time. The girls were late for school, and they knew it, and so they were writing their messages back and forth instead of talking because they didn't want to wake their mom up and get yelled at for being late. Eventually, they finished their notes, closed the notebook, then began getting ready to leave. When they would return home from school that afternoon, they would find their quiet home in this gated community in Georgia soaked with blood and an unspeakable horror waiting for them in the master bathroom. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please hide a Bluetooth speaker in the follow button's bedroom that plays cricket noises all night long. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of January 9th, 2010, 34-year-old Jarmeka Whitehead, whose friends all called her Nikki, spooned coleslaw onto a platter and watched as guests began to filter into her home, which was located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a gated community. Standing by the front door greeting the guests were Nikki's 16-year-old twin daughters, Jazz and Taz. Nikki had been nervous about hosting this party tonight, but so far, everything was going well. She'd made a fish fry, and her whole family had come and brought even more food. She had worked all day at the hair salon where she was a beautician, but she'd still had some time to decorate and hang up handwritten posters that read, "Taz and Jazz, welcome home, we love you." Now, Taz was here laughing it up with her family, and it made Nikki really happy. But as she looked around, she realized that Jazz was nowhere to be seen. Nikki frowned. This party was really supposed to be a celebration of forgiveness and new beginnings, but there was still a lot of hurt to get over in their little family. Because for the last year and a half, Taz and Jazz had not been living at home with Nikki. Nikki had lost custody of her kids after the three of them got into a huge fight and Nikki called the police. She had thought that calling the police would just scare the girls into behaving better, but that's not what happened. Instead, a judge decided that Nikki was not a fit parent and sent the girls to go live with Nikki's grandmother, Della Frazier. Nikki had been heartbroken. She herself had come from a tough background, and she had tried so hard to break the cycle for her kids. She had actually been raised by Della, who was her grandmother and so her daughter's great-grandmother, because when she was born, her own mom was in jail. And also, Nikki had gotten pregnant with the twin girls when she was just 18 years old. But when the girls were born, Nikki had decided that she would not let them make the same mistakes that she had. Instead, Nikki had tried to raise them with strict rules and to focus on academics. And so, Taz and Jazz became Girl Scouts, they did dance and music classes, and they made the honor roll at school. Until they became teenagers, everyone always said how sweet and well-behaved they were. But when they hit 13 years old, they began sneaking out and getting into fights, and nothing Nikki did seemed to rein them in. When Nikki finally lost custody of her kids to her grandmother Della, she had worried she might never get her girls back. But she had done a lot of hard work, including enrolling in college classes, and finally she had regained custody and her girls were home, living with her and her boyfriend Robert Head. Now, everything was not perfect at this point. The girls were very clingy to each other, and they openly said they missed Della, their great-grandmother. But for tonight, Nikki felt like, on the whole, things were pretty good. Except that one of the girls, Jazz, seemed to have disappeared from the party already. Nikki went and found her best friend and asked her to go look for Jazz. Her friend nodded and then slipped away, and Nikki waited nervously by the food for her friend to come back. And only a few minutes later, the friend returned with some good news. She said that Jazz was in her bedroom and was a bit overwhelmed by everything, but they had had a nice conversation about how excited everybody was to have them home. Nikki's friend said that both the girls seemed to be in good spirits, so Nikki should just relax and eat and enjoy the party. At this, Nikki felt a wave of relief wash over her. Then she went back to setting up the fish fry. 3 nights later, on January 12th at about 10:30 p.m., Nikki walked out of her evening class at the local college where she was studying to be a fashion designer and got into her car. It had been a bad day. All the happiness she had felt at the girls' welcome home party was now gone. But this time, it was not because of a fight she had had with the girls. Instead, it was because she and her boyfriend, Robert, had had a nasty argument that afternoon. Nikki and Robert had been together for a decade, and they really loved each other. But their relationship was a little unconventional. Part of it was that Robert was 30 years older than Nikki, and he worked as a long-haul trucker, so he was away from home for days or even weeks at a time. But none of that is what made their relationship truly unusual. What made it really atypical was that their relationship was open, meaning Nikki was allowed to have other boyfriends besides Robert. And this was ultimately what their fight that day had been about. According to the rules they had set up for their relationship, when Robert was home, they were an exclusive couple. But when Robert was away working, Nikki could date anybody she wanted. But Nikki was not supposed to talk to Robert about her other boyfriends. But this morning, she had taken a call from a man named Joe Carter, who she was dating, right in front of Robert. And Robert had been furious and insulted, and Nikki had left to come to class without resolving that fight. Now, all she really wanted to do was go home and relax and just be by herself. And she knew Robert had left on a trucking trip, and the girls were very likely asleep right now. But she couldn't just go home and do that, because the reason her other boyfriend, Joe Carter, had called her that morning was to ask her to come over to his house after her class. So Nikki shook off her exhaustion and drove to Joe's house and rang the bell, hoping that whatever Joe wanted, it would be quick. When Joe answered the door, he looked very serious. He invited Nikki inside, but he seemed incredibly tense and awkward. Nikki had a bad feeling, and she asked Joe what was wrong. But at first, he wouldn't even answer her directly. He just kept talking about old fights they'd had. Nikki had already had a long and emotionally draining day, so she told Joe that whatever was on his mind, he just needed to spit it out. So, Joe told her. He wanted to break up. He was done being part of her open relationship. Nikki was absolutely incredulous. Joe had made her come all the way out here late at night after class after all this just to break up with her? And also, just weeks after her daughters had finally come home, like this is supposed to be a good time in her life, and he's just crushing her? Nikki just stormed out of Joe's apartment and slammed the door behind her. The next day, January 13th, a little before 3:30 p.m., Nikki's twin daughters, Taz and Jazz, got home from school. They walked down Appaloosa Way and turned into the walkway of their home. When they got to the door, Jazz took out her keys and unlocked it. She pushed the door open and stepped in ahead of Taz. And as Jazz did this, she began to scream. Because the entire entryway was covered with blood. There was a trail of it leading into the house. They screamed out for their mother, but they got no answer. And so perhaps against their better judgment, they decided to go in and check on her. And so they followed the trail of blood that brought them all the way to the master bedroom. And when they looked into the master bathroom, they just stood there in silence before turning and bolting out of the house. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy was driving his cruiser down Appaloosa Way on his way back to the station after serving a warrant at one of the houses in the neighborhood when he saw two teenage girls sprinting towards his car at full speed. The deputy slammed on his brakes as the girls reached his cruiser and began banging on the windows. They were completely hysterical and screaming incoherently, and when the deputy got out of his cruiser, it took him a second to get them to calm down enough to tell him what was going on. But when they finally did, he radioed back to the station to request backup. About 30 minutes later, around 4 p.m., Detective Ken Swift of the Conyers Police Department stood inside the master bathroom of Nikki Whitehead's home on Appaloosa Way, looking down at Nikki's dead body, partially submerged under the water in the jacuzzi-style tub. This was the bloodiest crime scene that Swift had ever been to. The whole house had a stifling metallic smell from the sheer amount of blood that was soaked into the carpets and smeared all over the walls. Whatever had happened here, Swift could tell it had been long and very violent. The house was trashed. Chairs were tipped over, there were all these jagged pieces of something red and ceramic scattered in the living room, and the floor was littered with magazines that had been knocked off a coffee table. Now, Swift tried to count the number of stab wounds on his victim's body, but it was impossible. This level of brutality suggested pure rage, which meant that Nikki had very likely known her killer. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or anything stolen also supported this theory. Swift put on a pair of gloves and then bent down to gently touch Nikki's head. He could see lots of stab wounds in the back and front of her neck, and there was a strand of hair between her teeth. Swift asked a crime scene tech to take the hair for analysis. Then he stood up and followed the bloody drag marks back out of the bathroom and down the hallway. He found a bloody handprint on a door frame of the master bedroom and also on the doorknob of the front door. There were some bloody footprints of bare feet that officers had discovered outside that suggested that someone, very likely Nikki, had actually run out of the house during the attack, but had either turned around or, if it was Nikki, been dragged back inside. Swift stood at the front doorway looking out at those bloody footprints and also the sea of police vehicles with their flashing blue lights on. He was hopeful that a neighborhood canvass would turn up witnesses. This was, after all, a very safe and very quiet area. Someone running outside covered in blood was sure to attract attention. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes settled on two teenage girls standing on the front lawn with blankets draped over their backs. They were both visibly shaking with sobs and standing close together, and one of them had her arms up over her face. But as Swift watched, he realized that the girl with her arms up wasn't just crying. She was actually also biting her arm, with a look of pure anguish on her face. Now, Swift knew these girls were the victim's daughters, and he also knew they were the ones who found the body. And so, based on what he was seeing, it seemed like they had to be in shock. He was about to walk over to them and offer some words of comfort when a police captain actually intercepted him and just let him know that he had already arranged for the girls to be transported to the station. And so Swift decided he would talk to the girls there. About an hour later, Detective Swift was standing in the police station looking at a TV monitor that showed a live feed of the conference room, where the captain had put Jazz and Taz Whitehead. The girls had calmed down a little bit, but they were still rocking back and forth and obviously crying. By now, the officers had finished canvassing Nikki Whitehead's neighborhood, and shockingly, no one had seen anything. One neighbor reported hearing his doorbell ring in the morning and someone yelling, but he hadn't gotten out of bed to answer it. The only potentially useful information the police had gotten from neighbors was that they had seen a black car they didn't recognize parked on the street near Nikki's house around the time of the murder. But this was not a lot to go on. Until they got forensics back, Swift knew that Taz and Jazz Whitehead were his best hope for any leads. However, they were so distraught he didn't know what he would get out of an interview. But when Swift walked into the conference room, the girls appeared to try to pull themselves together, and Taz told Jazz they had to be strong. Swift put a box of tissues on the table and then gently asked the girls if they could walk him through what had happened. The girls took a minute to compose themselves, and then they began to speak. They told the detective that the day before, their mother had gotten into a bad argument with her boyfriend Robert. But they hadn't really resolved it, and then she had left for class and he had left for work. The girls said that night they stayed up late at their house, but they were in one of their bedrooms talking with each other, so when their mom came home, they didn't hear her. And then that morning, they had overslept and missed the bus. But they ended up walking to school because when they knocked on their mother's door, she didn't answer. The girls said at the time they hadn't thought much of it, and when they left the house, everything looked and seemed normal. They just hadn't seen their mom yet. But when they got home, of course it had been a different story. The house was ransacked, there was blood everywhere, and when they tried to call out for their mother and she didn't call back, they wound up searching the house, and they would ultimately find her dead inside the tub. At this point, the girls began to break down and start crying again, like they were reliving the moment they found their mother. And to Swift, this made sense. But really what he was thinking about was the part of the story where the girls referenced a fight between Nikki and her boyfriend Robert. The police had been trying to reach Robert ever since they found Nikki's body, but he was on the road in his semi-truck and they hadn't yet been able to track him down. And in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner was always the first suspect, especially when they were not getting along, and according to the girls, that's exactly what was happening right before Nikki had died. However, when Swift asked the girls if Robert and their mom fought often, Taz and Jazz were adamant that they didn't. They said they loved Robert, and so did their mom. Their biological father had not been in their lives, and Robert had really helped to raise them, taking them for rides in his truck and out to eat at McDonald's. He was great. So, Swift asked the twins if there was anybody else they could think of in their mother's life who maybe she wasn't getting along with or who might have wanted to do her harm. And it was at this point that Taz and Jazz brought up Joe Carter. The girls said their mom did really love Robert, But she talked to a lot of other men. And the one name the girls had been hearing a lot recently was Joe Carter, who was their mother's other boyfriend. Now, the way Taz and Jazz brought up this other boyfriend was very casual, like it was totally normal in their lives. But when Swift heard it, he immediately knew he had a compelling motive for Nikki's murder by either Robert or Joe, a love triangle. Detective Swift left the twins in the conference room and walked out of the police station to his cruiser. He couldn't question Nikki's primary boyfriend, Robert, until he could find him. But the twins had told him that Nikki's secondary boyfriend, Joe Carter, worked at a barbershop right next to Nikki's salon, and that was only about a 20-minute drive away from the station. Swift figured that if he hurried, he could catch Joe before his shop closed up for the day. He drove over, and when he stepped into the barbershop, a little bell on the door jingled. Everyone inside the shop reflexively glanced to see who had come in, and Swift cleared his throat and asked if a Joe Carter was around. When one of the barbers gestured that that was him, Swift asked him to step outside. Swift studied Joe's face carefully as he made this request, looking for any sign of nervousness, but Joe just looked confused. He told the customer whose hair he was cutting that he'd be right back, and then followed Swift out onto the sidewalk. Once they were outside, Joe immediately took out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Swift, but Swift shook his head and said no. Joe seemed relaxed and friendly, and like he had genuinely no idea why Swift might be there. So, based on that, Swift decided to just be direct. He told Joe that he had some terrible news. His girlfriend, Nikki Whitehead, had been murdered that morning, and so he needed to know where Joe had been last night. Immediately, Joe began to weep so hard he couldn't even answer the question. And then when he caught his breath, he just tried to light a cigarette, but his hands were shaking too hard to make the lighter even work. And then eventually he told Swift that he just couldn't believe it. He said he had actually seen Nikki the night before, and she was fine. He admitted they had been having some problems. In fact, he had broken up with her the night before because Nikki had another relationship with another man, Robert. And this caught Swift totally off guard. Joe's reaction definitely seemed sincere, but what he was saying, that he had broken up with the victim less than 12 hours before her murder, essentially because he was jealous of another man, was incredibly incriminating. So, Swift told Joe to show him his arms. The detective knew that a knife attack often caused injuries to the attacker as well as the victim, and he wanted to see if Joe had any wounds on his hands or arms. Swift felt a surge of adrenaline as Joe began to roll up his sleeves. But when Joe held out his arms and turned his hands up and then down again to show both sides, his skin was completely uninjured. Now, this was not proof that he was innocent, but it certainly did not make him a stronger suspect either. Joe told Swift he did have an alibi, at least for today. He said he'd been right here at work, which was 15 miles away from Nikki's house. All day long, this is where he was, and his coworkers and clients would all confirm it. With this, Swift was getting a sinking feeling that Joe might not be his guy. But to be thorough, he told him he was going to check on the video and also speak to his coworkers to confirm his alibi, and that Joe would have to come to the station to take a polygraph test. And Joe agreed. Then, right before Swift turned to leave, he remembered a detail from the canvas of Nikki's neighborhood, the unfamiliar black car one neighbor had seen right outside of Nikki's house. And so Swift paused for a second, and then he asked Joe what kind of car he drove. And Joe said he drove a black Toyota. Swift nodded and thanked Joe, and then walked back to his car to drive back to the station. Now, by this point, Joe was not his number one suspect anymore, but Joe had a black car, and also he didn't have an alibi for the night before when he saw Nikki until he showed up at the barbershop the next morning. There was a gap. And so Swift obviously could not rule him out. The following day was Thursday, January 14th. And Swift began the day at his desk, drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee and reading through a stack of papers. So far, he had one good theory about a love triangle that he thought was viable, but he also knew he wanted to keep an open mind about other possible ideas and suspects while he chased down the love triangle angle. The first packet of papers he was looking at were court documents from the ongoing custody case of Taz and Jazz over the last few years. From looking them over, Swift was quite interested to learn that the twins' great-grandmother, Della Fraser, who at one point had looked after the girls, had been very upset when Nikki had regained custody, at least in part because it meant Della would no longer receive money from the state for their care. Custody disputes and money were both reasons people killed each other. Swift knew this. But Della was 75 years old. Nikki's attacker would have had to be very strong with good stamina to stab Nikki that many times. So it didn't feel promising that Della was behind the murder. The second packet of papers that Swift was looking over that morning was the autopsy report. Nikki had been stabbed somewhere between 50 and 80 times, and her spinal cord had been severed. However, while that did give some information, it didn't really give Swift much more than he already knew. I mean, he just looked at the crime scene and knew this was a vicious attack, and the autopsy basically confirmed that. Finally, Swift had a few reports from the uniformed officers who had done the neighborhood canvass. They talked about the mysterious black car that had been spotted, that at this point Swift was thinking might belong to Joe Carter, the second boyfriend, but the uniformed officers also listed information about another mysterious car neighbors had seen. This one was a red sedan, specifically a Dodge Avenger, that had a white hood and missing hubcaps, and apparently it had shown up in the early afternoon outside of Nikki's house. No one saw the driver, and it only stayed for a few minutes. As Swift mulled over all this information he was taking in, the phone on his desk rang. When he answered, he was pleasantly surprised to hear the voice of Nikki's live-in boyfriend, Robert Head, the guy nobody could find. Robert apologized profusely for being so hard to reach and then asked, what's going on? When Swift told him that his girlfriend had been murdered, Robert let out this awful, anguished scream, and then he said he would head home right away. But Swift told him no, just come to the police station. Before Robert hung up, he said he had one more question. How were Taz and Jazz? To Swift, Robert's reaction to the news was fairly genuine, and his immediate concern for the girls did sound fatherly, which was how the girls had described him. But Swift also knew the man could be acting. When Robert arrived at the police station, Swift had him put in an interrogation room, where he watched for a few minutes on the surveillance camera before going inside himself. When Swift looked at Robert up close, he looked like a broken man. He was 64 years old and thin, and he was slumped in his seat looking absolutely miserable. When Swift sat down across from him, he could almost feel Robert's grief from the other side of the table. Robert would turn out to be a very easy interview. He answered all of Swift's questions clearly and fully, and didn't shy away from pretty embarrassing details. He said he knew about Joe Carter, and he didn't mind that Nikki was seeing him. Nikki was young and beautiful and outgoing, and Robert felt lucky that she even wanted to be with him at all. He said he was crazy about Nikki and about her girls, and really he just wanted her to be happy. He admitted to fighting with her the day before she was murdered over her phone call she took from Joe Carter right in front of him, sort of breaking one of their rules, but he said that as soon as he had left and hit the road in his truck, his anger had faded and he had considered their issue closed. And then when Swift told Robert to show him his arms, they were uninjured, just like Joe's. Finally, Robert's truck itself contained proof that he really could not have been the killer, because it had a GPS tracker inside, which put him a full day's drive away from the home by the time Nikki was killed. Swift ultimately left that interview feeling totally deflated. In a matter of just 24 hours, he'd identified two seemingly very good suspects in Robert and Joe. But now, both of those cases seem to be falling apart. Over the next few days, Swift tracked down every lead he could, but every lead he had seemed to hit a dead end. The crime scene unit hadn't found the murder weapon, and the crime scene itself was so bloody that forensic DNA evidence would take months to process. Joe Carter, who was Nikki's second boyfriend, passed his lie detector test, which included discussions around his whereabouts the night before the murder after he had broken up with Nikki at his house. Also, his coworkers the next day at the barbershop confirmed that he had been there all day that day. And on top of that, given the strength of his alibi now, the black car that was seen outside of Nikki's basically couldn't have been his. So Joe was ruled out. Swift interviewed the twins' great-grandmother, Della Frazier, who had been very upset about giving the girls back to Nikki, but even though he didn't think that she literally committed the murder, she did in fact have an alibi for the day of the murder, so she was ruled out as well. Swift even tracked down that red Dodge Avenger with the white hood and missing hubcaps, only to find that it belonged to a hairdressing client of Nikki's who had stopped by Nikki's house after Nikki had missed her appointment. The woman had left when Nikki didn't answer the door. As the days turned to weeks, the case began to go cold. Meanwhile, Nikki was buried, and the people in the gated community where she had lived began locking their doors at night. The twins, Taz and Jazz, were living with Della again, and Nikki's whole family was pressing the police to come up with an answer. What happened to Nikki? But Swift, despite his best efforts, was running out of ideas. But finally, one day in mid-May of 2010, so almost 4 full months after Nikki's murder, Swift got his first piece of good news. He'd walked into the police station that morning to work on a different case altogether, but when he sat down at his desk, he found the forensic reports from Nikki's crime scene. All the blood that had been soaked into the carpet and smeared on the walls had finally been tested for DNA. So had the hair that Swift had found inside of Nikki's mouth. And the results were shocking. When Swift finished reading them, he stood up, walked out of the station, and drove his cruiser to a gas station that was right up the street from Nikki's house. He knew police had not pulled surveillance video from the station because it was too far from the crime scene to be useful, or so they thought. But now, based on the DNA evidence Swift had, he knew that this gas station might be his very best hope to solve the case. When he pulled into the gas station parking lot, he went inside and asked the attendant to speak to the manager. The teenager behind the counter ducked into a back room and then motioned Swift to follow him. Once inside, Swift could barely contain his eagerness as he introduced himself to the manager and then quickly asked if he still had the surveillance footage from the morning of January 13th. This was critical. Swift knew that even if the gas station did have working cameras, the odds of the footage being stored for months were low. But the owner sat down at his computer, clicked around a few files, and then turned to Swift and grinned. He hadn't gotten around to wiping the footage, so everything Swift needed was still here, right in his files. Swift told the manager what specific time frame to search for in the file, and then once the manager had done that, he hit play. And when Swift watched the footage, he knew exactly who had killed Nikki. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of a 4-month investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Whitehead on the morning of January 13th, 2010. Nikki's killer was waiting for her in her own kitchen. Nikki heard the killer moving around from inside her bedroom and walked down the hallway to come see who it was. When she first saw the killer, who was there with an accomplice, Nikki actually was not afraid. She was just annoyed. She told the killer and their accomplice to explain themselves. Then, when they refused, she told them to get out of the house. And it was at that point that they attacked. They leapt onto Nikki's back and began to punch her over and over again. Nikki fought back, biting them, and in the struggle, she bit down on a strand of one of their hairs, which got caught in her teeth. The fight moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Nikki briefly broke free, but the killer picked up a red ceramic vase and threw it at Nikki's head. The vase shattered and Nikki staggered, and that's when the killer grabbed a steak knife from a block on the kitchen counter, and they lunged. They began stabbing Nikki over and over as Nikki screamed. Panicked and now severely injured, Nikki made one final desperate run for safety. She bolted out the front door of her house. And she made it out the front door and down her walkway all the way over to a neighbor's front door, where she rang the bell and began shouting out for help, but her neighbor didn't come. And before she could run to the next house, the killer and their accomplice rushed up behind her and dragged Nikki back inside of her own house without being seen. Back inside, the killer and the accomplice slammed the door shut and threw Nikki up against a wall, where Nikki's braids left a bloody print. Nikki stood for a moment and then crumpled to the floor. And without hesitating, the killer jumped on Nikki and stabbed her again, over and over, until she was dead. After that, the killer and the accomplice dragged Nikki's lifeless body down the hallway and into the bathroom. They ran the water in the tub and then heaved Nikki's body up and over the edge. It was done. They stood there for a minute, just staring down at their work. After that, they cleaned themselves up and then put on their backpacks, slipped out the front door, and began their walk to school. And one of the first buildings they would have to pass on their walk to school was the gas station. And that gas station would have a surveillance camera that would capture them walking 2 full hours later than what they would tell police. It would turn out Nikki's killers were her own 16-year-old twin daughters, Taz and Jazz Whitehead. The twins had told police that they didn't see their mother that morning, but that was a lie. They had gotten up late, and instead of going to school, they had been writing notes to each other and laughing in the kitchen when Nikki had woken up, come in, and asked why they weren't at school. Taz and Jazz were already furious to be back home. They didn't want to be there, they resented their mother and all her strict rules, and for whatever reason, that morning when their mom confronted them, it just felt like the final straw. And so they stabbed her to death, and then went to school like it was just another day. When they got home, they put on this big act of being distraught and horrified by the violent scene they themselves had created, and then ran outside to go tell police. But what the twins didn't realize was that during the vicious attack, one of them got a strand of their hair caught in Nikki's teeth, and then also their own blood mingled with Nikki's. Because Taz and Jazz were identical twins, the police were never actually able to pinpoint which of them did what, but it was very clear they were directly involved in the killing. Also, after this DNA report came back and Swift read it, it prompted him to go to that gas station, which he knew would have been along the walk to the girls' school. And he quickly discovered they had lied to him about what time they had actually walked to school. Also, it was later determined that some of those bite marks on the girls' bodies that police had originally assumed the girls had made themselves out of grief were actually made by their mother during the attack. But the final and perhaps most cold-blooded piece of evidence were the notes the girls had written to each other in their notebook on the morning of the murder. Literally, they wrote these right before they killed their mom. One twin wrote on the last page of the notebook, quote, "She don't care. She's selfish. She needs to go." And the other twin wrote their response, which was, quote, "That's what I think also. She gotta go ASAP." On May 21st, 2010, Taz and Jazz Whitehead were arrested for the murder of their mother, Nikki. They ultimately pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Both twins blamed Nikki for starting the fight and said that she actually attacked them. However, officials do not believe this account. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One summer day in 1978, a man came home from work to his house in a nice neighborhood in Illinois, and when he went inside the front door, he called out to his fiancée. But she didn't call back. The man stood there looking around the house, and immediately he was struck with annoyance because the house was a total mess, and his wife had actually stayed home from work that day because she said she was going to straighten up the house, and clearly she had not. But after searching the house, the man had not found his wife yet, and so he started to wonder if she was actually okay. The only place left to check for her was down in the basement. So the man opened the door and began walking down the stairs. When he got to the bottom, he would come face to face with a nightmare. But before we get into that story, I want to tell you about our brand new merch collection on shopmrballin.com. There's an amazing hoodie, there's a crew neck, there's even a special seagull lung pin. And each of these pins is individually numbered, and there's only 500 available, so get them before they're gone. The shop is open right now, so go to shopmrballin.com and have a wonderful holiday season. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of June 20th, 1978, rock and roll music blasted from inside a little white house on Acton Avenue in the suburb of Wood River, Illinois. Inside the house, 22-year-old Carla Lou Brown set 4 pizzas down on a pile of milk crates that for that night served as her dining room table. The petite blonde woman was exhausted from hauling boxes and furniture all day, but she wanted to thank the friends who had helped move her and her fiancé into their new home, so she was hosting a house party. Carla's best friend, Debbie, raised her beer into the air and said that hopefully this house would soon be filled with the pitter-patter of little feet running around. Carla, who was looking forward to getting pregnant, beamed and looked over at her fiancé, Mark Hart. Mark was laughing, but he had his hands up in front of his face as if to say, slow down here. He joked that before they had kids, he'd just like to get their boxes unpacked first. Carla had been dating Mark, the 27-year-old apprentice electrician, since he returned from the war in Vietnam. Carla was totally crazy about him, but their 5-year courtship had been anything but smooth. Mark was one of the few men in Carla's life who had not immediately thrown himself at her feet and done whatever it took to make her happy. At 4 foot 11 inches tall, Carla was shorter than most girls in Wood River, but that hadn't stopped her from becoming a varsity cheerleader in high school. She was kind and approachable, which made her popular with boys and girls alike, and she was curvy enough to attract wolf whistles from total strangers out on the street. But Mark was different. She had to chase him, because Mark was one of those guys who started sweating at the thought of commitment. He had broken things off with Carla more than once before when the pressure to settle down just got to him. But he always came back. And now, finally, the couple was not only engaged to be married, but they also had just bought a house together. Carla sipped her beer and thought to herself how much she wished her father could see how far she had come. Ever since he died in an accident when she was just 11 years old, Carla had been looking for a real home. She and her mom had fought so much that Carla moved out as a teenager. She lived with her best friend Debbie and other friends, bouncing from place to place, until now. It was barely 1,000 square feet of living space, but to Carla, this new home for her and Mark was a dream house. A loud knock on the front door suddenly brought Carla's focus back to the party. Carla got up and walked over to the door, and she opened it up. And standing outside was a shaggy-looking guy in his early 20s named Lee Barnes. Carla had seen Lee while she and Mark were moving in earlier that day. Lee had been drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana with 2 other guys at the house next door. One of them had made a lewd remark about Carla's breasts, but then Lee called out to her by name and said they went to high school together, though she only vaguely remembered him. Carla mustered a good-natured hello, but quickly just went back to unpacking. And now that guy, Lee, was standing on her porch, asking to join the party along with his 2 buds, Paul Maines and John Prant. Lee told Carla that they had marijuana they would share if they would share that pizza with him and his friends. He said, "Come on, it'll be fun." But Carla had no desire to invite this trio into her home. This was a special night for Carla, and she only wanted to share it with people closest to her. So she told Lee that she was tired and they were about to wrap things up anyways, and so maybe they could hang out another time. Lee looked mildly annoyed at the rejection, but he took the hint and left, with his pals trailing right behind him. Carla shut the front door and then put another Blondie album on the record player. Soon all the girls were dancing and Carla was swaying right along with the beat, and as she did, she looked over at Mark. And Mark gazed back at her as if she was the only woman in the world. The next day, Carla took the day off from her job in customer service at an airplane parts company. She had way too much to do getting settled into her new home, including cleaning up the trash from the party the night before. But so far, on this kind of unexpected day off, she'd spent most of the morning on the phone. At 9, she called her best friend Debbie, who was home with her baby, and then after she hung up with Debbie, Mark's mother called her, and she really liked to talk. Carla glanced at the clock. It was already 11 a.m., and Mark's mom showed no sign of slowing down. Carla was starting to feel guilty that she was getting so little done with this day off. While Mark was hard at work, Carla was supposed to be organizing their house. So eventually, Carla made up a lie that she had just heard someone knock at her front door, and so she needed to go, and so Mark's mother took the hint, and they hung up. And so now that Carla was finally free, she just headed downstairs to the finished basement where the couple had left their unpacked boxes, and Carla got back to work. But minutes later, Carla was unpacking a 10-gallon barrel labeled Mark that contained his clothes when she heard footsteps coming down the stairs to the basement. Figuring that Mark must have forgotten something before he left for work, Carla stopped what she was doing and she turned around with a big smile on her face, ready to greet her husband. A little after 5 o'clock that evening, Carla's husband, Mark, pulled up to the house in a pickup truck driven by his friend Tom. They were hauling a large doghouse behind them. Mark knew how much Carla loved his parents' golden retriever dog, so he planned to get a dog for her as soon as they were settled in. Mark told Tom that he kind of secretly hoped that Carla would love this puppy so much that she might wait on having a kid right away. Once the pickup truck came to a stop, Mark slid out of the passenger seat and walked up the front path to his one-story clapboard house and went in the front door. He expected to find Carla, but didn't see her in the living room. And she didn't answer when he called her name. Mark picked up an empty beer can from the night before and took it into the kitchen. As he threw it into the trash can, he noticed that the back door was ajar. He felt annoyed with Carla for leaving it open because all sorts of insects could get in. He shut the door, then joined his friend Tom outside. They carried the doghouse to the backyard and set it down under the shade of an oak tree. Then Mark invited his friend inside for a tour of their new house. He showed Tom their bedroom and the spare room that Carla was already calling the baby's room, and then Mark asked Tom if he wanted to go downstairs and see his favorite part of the house, the basement. Tom said, yeah, let's do it. So Mark led the way down the steps to the basement, where he had set up the TV and a sofa. No matter what was going on upstairs, he told Tom as they walked down, we can always watch football in peace down here. But when they actually got downstairs, Mark immediately noticed something strange. The sofa appeared to be soaking wet, and the TV tray in front of it was turned upside down. Beside the sofa were several dark red drops on the basement floor, and Mark wondered if maybe it was blood. And so in a second, his mood switched from being annoyed to being very anxious. Mark looked rapidly around the room for some explanation for what was going on, but everything else seemed totally normal. Then Mark turned toward these swinging doors that led to the laundry room, and in the gap between the bottom of the doors and the floor, he could see Carla's bare legs. Suddenly panicking, Mark screamed out Carla's name, but Carla didn't answer, and so Mark ran into the laundry room, and what he saw in there was worse than anything he saw in Vietnam. Carla was kneeling on the ground with her hands tied behind her back, and her head was submerged in a 10-gallon barrel full of water. Carla was also naked from the waist down. Mark ran over to the barrel and saw bubbles in the water around Carla's head, and for just a second he thought maybe he could save her. But when he frantically pulled her head out of the water, he saw her complexion was already gray, and she had 2 long gashes across her forehead, as well as serious bruising under her chin. Also, 2 of Mark's socks were tied tightly around Carla's neck, digging into her skin. Mark checked her wrist for a pulse, but couldn't find one. And so as Mark cradled his fiancée in his lap and began to cry, Tom raced upstairs and called 911. The first police officer arrived at the house just before 6 p.m. His name was Don Greer, and he was a 27-year-old from the Wood River Police. And he actually knew Mark. They were old friends who used to go out on double dates together. When Greer heard the 911 report of a deceased woman at Mark Hart's new address, his heart sank. He hoped it was a mistake. When Greer arrived at the house, he would find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, staring ahead with glassy eyes. Mark looked up and seemed to recognize his old friend, but all he could say was, "She's down in the basement." Greer went directly down the stairs to where Mark and Tom had laid a red blanket over Carla, who was now face down on the floor. When Greer looked beneath the blanket, he was shocked by the brutality of the murder. It looked like Carla had been beaten as well as strangled and probably raped too. But he had been told that her head was underwater when she was found, so maybe she had drowned. But it certainly wasn't easy to determine just from looking at her what killed Carla. There were just too many possibilities. Wood River was just across the Mississippi River from the city of St. Louis, so big city crime did show up in this town periodically. But murders were rare, and usually they were just the result of a bar fight or some other physical altercation. Greer had never seen a homicide in Wood River that was this violent and perverse. In fact, no one in the Wood River police force had. And for Greer, this was not just any murder victim. It was his friend's fiancée. Greer could scarcely concentrate on sizing up the crime scene. He felt like he should run upstairs to comfort his friend after such a horrible loss, but Greer couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't come off phony. So Greer settled for going upstairs and laying his hand on Mark's shoulder before asking Mark and Tom to please tell him exactly what happened. Mark began talking about how excited he was to show Carla this new doghouse, but as he spoke, Greer could only think about the nightmare in the basement. The Wood River police were going to need help to solve this murder. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m., crime scene technician Alva Bush of the Illinois State Police pulled up to the house on Acton Ave. Greer didn't know him personally, but Bush was the first guy the chief had wanted to call when Greer told him they needed a high-level crime scene analyst. Bush, who was a Vietnam veteran and former narcotics officer, was built like a bear and was known to speak bluntly. But at only 30 years old, he was already the most perceptive and intuitive crime scene tech in the state. Bush walked into the kitchen and introduced himself to Mark, who was clutching a framed photograph of Carla. Bush looked closely at her smiling face as Mark tearfully recounted how he had found his fiancée in the basement. Bush then headed to the basement with Greer, glad that he saw Carla in life before he saw her as a murder victim. Bush's first reaction when he reached the crime scene was irritation. Mark and Tom, in their desperation to save Carla, had moved her body to the floor and away from the barrel of water where they found it. It always made Bush's work harder when someone tampered with the crime scene before he arrived. Clues were almost always lost. Nonetheless, he quickly started forming a mental picture of the crime that had unfolded right here. Greer removed the blanket to show Carla's body to Bush, and it didn't take a genius to suspect sexual assault. Carla was nude from the waist down. Bush examined the wounds on Carla's face. The cuts ran parallel across her forehead, bloody but too shallow to be fatal. He wondered what would make a wound like that. The socks tied around Carla's neck made it look like she had been strangled with them, but Bush thought the knots were too neat to have caused her death. A death struggle is messy business, and these socks looked more like a decorative scarf than a murder weapon. Bush told Greer that the killer very likely tied these socks around her neck after she was already dead. Bush also doubted that Carla had drowned. The water inside the 10-gallon barrel where Carla's head was submerged had only the slightest tinge of red, even though Carla had fresh bleeding wounds on her face. That told Bush that she was most likely already dead when the killer dunked her head inside of the water. And the more Bush looked around, the more he became convinced that the killer must have deliberately rearranged the entire crime scene before they fled. The brightly colored wool sweater Carla was still wearing was just too neat. The single button near the neckline was still fastened, which seemed really unlikely to Bush considering there must have been a life-and-death struggle. Also, it seemed unlikely that Carla would be wearing a sweater at all on a warm June day. And so Bush figured the killer must have dressed Carla in the sweater after they killed her. Likewise, Bush thought the cords wrapped around Carla's wrists were added for show as well. The bonds were so loose that there was just no way that could have kept Carla's hands bound, especially, again, in the middle of a life-and-death struggle. Bush concluded that the killer very likely assaulted Carla while she was on the couch, and then bashed her in the head with something and then strangled her as she bled. Afterwards, the killer very likely tried to wash the blood off the couch, which is why the cushions looked soaked, and then, very likely, the killer dragged Carla's body to the laundry room, where he dressed her in the sweater, tied the socks around her neck, and then stuck her head in the water to make it look like she had drowned. And then, just before the killer left, they very likely took Carla's panties as some kind of sick trophy. But as Bush thought about this, he also thought to himself, why would this killer have gone to all this trouble to stage the crime scene? I mean, that would require the killer to stick around the murder scene for a long period of time, making it more and more likely they would get caught. Bush could see that the killer clearly thought it was important to try to confuse the investigators, but Bush also wondered if maybe the murderer was also just trying to send some kind of chilling message. The murder scene reminded Bush of the work of the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy, who raped and murdered dozens of young women. But Bundy had been arrested a few months earlier, so it couldn't have been him. However, Bush wondered if maybe they had a new serial killer on their hands that might have been inspired by Ted Bundy. Police quickly determined that the last person to speak with Carla had been Mark's mother, and she would say they were on the phone right up until about 11 that morning. So, using that as a frame of reference, police began going door to door asking neighbors about what they might have heard or seen that day between 11 a.m., when we know Carla was still alive, and 5 p.m., when Mark came home and found Carla dead. Greer knocked on the door of the house next to Carla and Mark's, where those three guys had been smoking pot and drinking beer and calling out lewd remarks to Carla before going over to Carla's house and trying to go to her party. And so the door opened, but there was a screen that separated Greer from a skinny 22-year-old Paul Main who was standing inside. Greer asked Paul if he could come inside and speak with him, and Paul immediately looked super nervous and taken aback, and Greer had an idea why. He could smell the pot smoke from where he was standing. Greer promised Paul that he was not there to try to bust him for marijuana. It was fine. Paul nodded and opened the screen door. Greer stepped inside the house. The walls were totally bare, other than a few rock posters, and the furniture looked really old and ragged. Greer sat down across from Paul at a card table and then asked him what he'd been up to until 5 p.m. that day. Paul said he was home for most of it. He said he was alone until noon, when his friend John Prant came over to hang out until about 3, when Paul had to go run some errands. But Paul said he didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. He said Carla and Mark had only moved in the day before, so he scarcely knew them. Paul said that his friend Lee knew Carla from high school, and they had gone over to greet the newcomers the night before, but Carla and her boyfriend did not seem very interested in socializing with them, so they had left. And so that was the last time Paul said he saw Carla. As for Paul's friends, Lee and John, they were no more help when Greer tracked them down. Lee wasn't even in the neighborhood on the day of the murder, and John told Greer that he was in the neighborhood. He was at Paul's place twice that day, first early in the morning when he was out delivering job applications, and then from noon to about 3, he was back at Paul's place when he was just hanging out. And just like Paul, John said he did not see anything out of the ordinary. And that's how it went with all the potential witnesses. Greer went door after door, but no one had heard or seen anything unusual on Acton Ave that day. Somehow the killer had violently assaulted and killed Carla Brown without anybody noticing. Autopsy results the next day confirmed just how violent Carla's final moments had been. She had a broken jaw and deep bruises all over her neck, in addition to the cuts on her forehead. She also had bits of skin underneath her fingernails, likely from scratching her assailant's face and back. But unfortunately, in the 1970s, DNA analysis was not an option. What the coroner did not find was significant water in Carla's lungs, which he would have expected with a drowning. Bush had been right. She did not drown at all. The coroner ruled that she had died from strangulation, likely by a cable or the killer's bare hands, before she was placed in that barrel of water. Now, the investigators were sure the killer had staged the crime scene. All across Wood River that day, June 22nd, people woke up to front-page news about the shocking murder of Carla Brown, along with a picture of Carla from her senior yearbook. The article described the crime as being potentially a sexual murder, possibly tied to a recent string of incidents in the community. Over the past 15 months, a man had attacked 14 women in their homes, and he was still at large. But Bush told the Wood River police that he didn't buy that theory. That serial rapist who was attacking women in their homes always broke in at night, but Carla was killed in the middle of the day, and the serial rapist did not kill his victims. But there were enough obvious similarities between those attacks and the attack on Carla that Bush knew he couldn't totally rule out the serial rapist theory. In fact, Bush and the Wood River police were having a hard time ruling out anyone as a suspect, from strangers to her fiancé. They believed that the murder was a sex crime, but they had very few clues as to who did it. Greer knew that the first suspect in all these kinds of cases is the domestic partner, but Greer felt like his old friend Mark was a very unlikely murderer. Not only was he clearly distraught at his fiancé's death, but Mark's boss confirmed to Greer that he had been working at a job site all day. And so Greer told the chief that they should focus on other possibilities. Greer spent a big part of June 22nd talking to all 10 guests who had gone to Carla and Mark's house party, but most of them couldn't imagine who would want to hurt someone as nice as Carla. One guy told Greer that Carla was really good at saying the right thing when people felt down. This guy was very self-conscious about the fact that he was quite short, but Carla, who was several inches shorter than him, once told him that he was tall to her. Greer was starting to think that he was not going to get any useful information from these 10 people, but when he sat down with the last person, Carla's best friend Debbie, she would identify 2 potential suspects that in theory could have wanted to do harm to Carla. The first suspect was an ex-boyfriend in Connecticut that Carla dated over a year ago during one of her breakups with Mark. The guy took it really hard when Carla broke it off to return to Mark, and he kept getting in touch with Carla for months. Debbie couldn't remember his name, though. Debbie also fingered Carla's stepfather, a heavy drinker with a temper. She said that when she and Carla were seniors in high school, Carla's stepfather tried to force himself on Carla. Afterwards, Carla excused his behavior, saying he was drunk, but drunk or not, Debbie called it attempted rape. Carla's mother eventually had the marriage annulled. Both of these suspects that Debbie brought up were intriguing possibilities, but Greer quickly got information that scratched both of them from his list of suspects. The ex-boyfriend was in New Jersey on business on the day of the murder, while Carla's stepfather said that he and Carla had remained close, and he had recently even given her money for dental work, and he also easily passed a lie detector test to prove he never assaulted Carla and had nothing to do with Carla's death. By the day of Carla's funeral, which was Saturday, June 24th, investigators were getting frustrated at their lack of progress. 3 days after the crime, and they still had no strong suspect. At 1 p.m., Woodland Hill Cemetery filled up with residents from Wood River who gathered to say goodbye to Carla. So many of them had brought flowers that the local shop had to stop taking orders. 6 pallbearers carried Carla's casket from the hearse to the gravesite. Mark had chosen all former boyfriends of Carla's who had remained friends with her. Greer watched the crowd, looking for anything unusual, but all he saw was a community in pain. He felt so much pressure to bring justice to these people and to bring it fast. But the investigation seemed to just be going backwards. In fact, the lab had just called to say that every fingerprint they had found in the basement was either Carla's or Mark's, so the killer didn't even leave behind any prints. Greer watched as Carla's casket was lowered into the ground, and he thought to himself, this can't be the end of the story. 5 days after the murder, the Illinois State Police sent a detective named Randy Rushing to take a fresh look at the evidence. The muscular former state trooper with the handlebar mustache had taught criminal law at the police academy before joining the Department of Criminal Investigations. Now, he was supposed to give the case a top-to-bottom review to see if there was something the local police had missed. And Rushing was interested in the potheads next door to Carla and Mark, noting that Paul and John had given slightly different accounts of where they'd been the day of the murder. John had said he had visited Paul around 8:30 a.m., while Paul didn't remember seeing John until noon. Detective Rushing wondered if they were hiding something. But once again, the theory went nowhere. John passed a polygraph test easily, and Paul, he did fail part of the test, but the test administrator thought that it might have to do with him being nervous, or maybe he was high, or both. In fact, Paul was slurring his words during the test. And so Rushing and the test administrator both agreed that the polygraph tests gave them very little to work with. But they planned to keep their eye on Paul Maines because technically he did fail the polygraph. For a brief moment in late July, so about a month after the killing, investigators got excited when Wood River Police arrested a 21-year-old man named Tony Garza for breaking into a woman's house and trying to rape her. Garza actually confessed to the 14 break-ins and sexual assaults that had occurred in town over the previous 15 months. But Garza was adamant that he had nothing to do with Carla Brown's death, and he too passed a polygraph test. Detective Rushing still had his suspicions about Garza. A violent assault could easily turn into a murder after all, but he had no evidence connecting the alleged rapist to Carla Brown. No fingerprints, no witnesses. So investigators kept Garza on their list of suspects, even though they knew it didn't mean much. They had no more evidence against Garza than they did for several other potential suspects, including that next-door neighbor, Paul Maines, who failed a portion of his polygraph. Rushing, Greer, and the rest of the investigators knew they needed a break in the case or no one would be held accountable for Carla's murder. And by the fall of 1978, with no main suspect in sight, the state police finally pulled Rushing off the case. Greer kept the case open, but as months and even years passed by with no new leads, he worried that Carla Brown's murder might never be solved. By June of 1980, so 2 years after the murder, the investigation was in the deep freeze, and Carla's fiancé, Mark, had given up hope that her killer would ever be brought to justice. Bush, the crime scene analyst, had worked on literally hundreds of other criminal cases since the murder of Carla Brown. But he never forgot Carla's smiling face in the photo that Mark was holding that day, or the terrible injuries she had suffered at the hands of her killer. And the idea that her killer was getting away with murder really gnawed at Bush. At the time, Bush was in New Mexico to testify at another trial when he attended a police seminar on a new investigative technique called computer image enhancement. He sat on the edge of his seat in a university lecture hall as a forensic dentist, Dr. Homer Campbell, explained how the computer could transform a two-dimensional photograph into a three-dimensional image, giving police new insights into crime scenes. Dr. Campbell demonstrated how this technique enabled investigators to scour a picture in a much deeper way, picking up details that were previously invisible. After the lecture ended, Bush walked right up to Campbell and said, "Hey, I have a case for you." He explained that Carla Brown's murder had baffled investigators, in part because the killer had completely rearranged the crime scene, making it hard for them to find real clues. He said investigators were particularly puzzled by two parallel cuts on Carla's forehead. Campbell was intrigued. So the next day, Bush sent over the crime scene photos from Carla's murder, and Dr. Campbell ran them through his computer enhancement process, and then afterwards he asked Bush if he could take a look at the TV tray that was found next to Carla's sofa that was visible in the pictures. When Campbell had zoomed in really tightly on the tray, he discovered a strand of Carla's blonde hair and some of her blood. Instantly, Campbell realized that whoever Carla's killer was had struck her with the TV tray. That's where those cuts had come from on Carla's head. Then Dr. Campbell asked Bush about the bite mark. Bush froze. He was not aware of any bite mark on Carla. He had focused on the heavy bruising around Carla's neck from the strangulation and ignored what looked like a relatively minor bruising around her collarbone. But studying the enhanced photograph, Dr. Campbell found the telltale marks left by a set of teeth. Bush initially blamed himself. How could he have missed a bite mark on the body? But Dr. Campbell assured him that without the enhancement, no one would have caught it. Now the question was, could this be used to identify the killer? Dr. Campbell believed that a bite mark was almost as good as a fingerprint. In fact, it was Dr. Campbell's testimony about a bite mark in the Ted Bundy murder trial 2 years earlier that helped convict Ted Bundy. With Campbell's big discovery, they could now compare suspects' teeth against the shape of the bite mark on Carla. Without a court order, it would not be easy to get suspects to agree to have molds made of their teeth, but Bush had a plan to get what they needed. And he called Rushing, the state police detective, to help. Of all the people investigators had spoken to, Carla's next-door neighbor, Paul, the guy who had partially failed the polygraph, was still at the top of their list of suspects. And even without a mold of his teeth, they could tell that Campbell's bite mark analysis suggested he could be their guy. Whoever killed Carla had crooked teeth, and just from looking at Paul, he also clearly had crooked teeth. But by this time, September of 1980, so 2 years and 3 months after Carla's murder, Paul no longer lived on Acton Avenue. But Wood River police officer Don Greer, who by this point had been promoted to deputy chief, tracked Paul down at a YMCA about 15 minutes away, and he gave him a call. Greer lied and told Paul that he was calling from an insurance company that had a check for him, money he was owed from an accident a few years back. Now, this was a deliberate deception, one that would likely be tossed out by a court as unethical today, but back in 1978, it worked like a charm. Paul came right to the closed insurance company building that police were using as their front, and he presented himself at the front desk, ready to receive his check, But very quickly, Paul realized he had walked into a trap. Paul looked even thinner than when Greer had questioned him 2 years earlier. Rushing noticed that Paul was trembling and thought there was a good chance he would crack and give a confession. But Paul stuck to his original story when he was asked. He said he had no idea who killed Carla. But Greer and Rushing did not believe him, and they made that very clear to him. They said there was only one way he could prove his innocence: let them take an impression of his teeth to compare against the killer's teeth. And Paul agreed. They overnighted the impression of Paul's teeth to Dr. Campbell, and then all the investigators held their breath until they heard back the next day. Finally, 27 months after the crime, they hoped they were on the brink of justice for Carla. But when Dr. Campbell called, he had disappointing news. The forensic dentist told them that the photographs, even with the computer enhancements, were not good enough to declare Paul's bite as a match. Paul could be the killer, but Campbell was not certain. Rushing, Greer, and Bush alike were crushed. The Carla Brown case was cold again. And it would stay that way for 2 more years, until one chilly day in March of 1982, when Detective Rushing met an FBI agent who would go on to help break the case wide open with absolutely stunning psychological insights into the mind of their killer. Rushing was at a conference in St. Louis when he attended a session led by Agent John Douglas, who was a pioneer in the art of profiling suspects so that police knew who to look for. Douglas's 6-person team specialized in creating psychological profiles of serial killers. The tall, slender agent wearing a vest and tie talked about traveling the country to speak with killers like Charles Manson and others less famous but no less deadly to understand how their minds worked. Rushing was totally mesmerized by Douglas's way of analyzing killers' motives and weaknesses. And so Rushing couldn't help but wonder, what kind of suspect would Douglas profile if he looked at the Carla Brown case? And so after the talk was over, Rushing approached Douglas and asked for his help. And Douglas agreed. 6 weeks later, Bush and Rushing piled into an unmarked police car to make the 800-mile drive to FBI headquarters in Virginia to go over the case with John Douglas. Greer, who was now Wood River's chief of police, flew back from a vacation in Florida to join them on this trip. When the investigators arrived at the sprawling FBI campus, an agent from Douglas's behavioral science unit escorted them to a conference room. They spread pictures from the crime scene across the table. Then Douglas breezed into the room, shook hands, and started examining the photos. A few minutes later, he sat back in his chair, assembling the details he had just formed in his head, and then he launched into a highly specific description of the killer that was so precise it was like he actually knew him and was there in the basement 4 years earlier when the crime happened on June 20th, 1978. He said the crime scene looked disorderly, which made him think the killer was a shaggy-looking, disorderly person. Someone with low self-esteem who was awkward with women and had a history of rejection. Douglas then said the killer likely drove a beat-up old car, something like a red or orange Volkswagen. Now, to Bush, Rushing, and Greer, it almost seemed like Douglas was just making things up as he went along. And so as Douglas spoke, they began exchanging doubtful looks and wondered if they drove all this way for nothing. But Douglas wasn't done. He said it was common for killers to keep something from their victims. And when he said this, Bush looked knowingly at Greer, because 4 years ago, they had discussed the fact that Carla's panties were missing from the crime scene, and maybe they had been taken as a trophy. Douglas then said that the Carla Brown murder scene had some of the trappings of a serial killer, especially the way the killer had moved things around to create the appearance that Carla had drowned in that 10-gallon barrel. But Douglas said the killer had never killed anyone before Carla, and the killer probably did not come over to Carla's house to kill her. This surprised the investigators, and so Rushing asked Douglas how he could possibly know that. And Douglas just pointed to the photograph showing the soaking wet sofa, and he said, well, it looks like the perp tried to revive his victim by splashing water on her. That does not seem like a killer who just goes around killing people. This seems like maybe it happened by accident. Bush's jaw dropped. The wet sofa had perplexed him and all of his investigators for 4 years. Douglas said the strangulation and blows to the face indicated a personal confrontation. Maybe Carla rejected him sexually and he struck back. In cases like that, Douglas said, the killer usually faces the victim and attacks the face and neck. Douglas would go on and describe this case as what he called a neighborhood crime, meaning it was likely committed by someone living nearby or literally in the victim's household. Douglas looked at the three men and told them that very likely they had already interviewed the killer. Rushing piped up and said, well, what would happen if the killer took a polygraph? Douglas shook his head, uncertain. He felt the polygraph was not a reliable tool. He'd seen too many cases where the killer beat the test, but was convicted on other evidence. Greer wondered what that meant for their case. All of their potential suspects had passed their polygraph, except for Paul, who had failed a portion of it. Then Douglas looked at the photograph of the blood droplets from the crime scene again, and he said the killer must have had blood on him, and so after Carla was dead, the killer must have gone somewhere nearby to try to clean himself up. And when Greer heard that, he thought, well, if the killer was Paul, how much closer than next door can you get? Because Paul lived next door to Carla. Bush, Greer, and Rushing were already blown away by Douglas's insights. But then the FBI agent leaned across the table and delivered the best news of all. Since their killer was almost certainly an amateur killer, he would easily crack under pressure. Douglas suggested that the police should mount a psychological warfare campaign in the media. He said that they should play up ways that emerging technology has helped them gather evidence, how the photo enhancement led to the discovery of the bite mark, and how psychological profiling enabled them to narrow down their suspect list. Basically, Douglas was telling them to use the media to try to trick the killer into thinking that their arrest was imminent. Then Bush brought up the idea of digging up Carla's body. Dr. Campbell had suggested that the casket, if it kept the water out as it was designed to, could preserve the body for some time. Whatever bruising occurred would still be present in the skin. They could get a better look at the bite mark on her neck and match it to suspect's teeth, Bush noted. Douglas said spreading the news that police were about to exhume Carla's body would be the perfect way to destabilize their target. The killer, Douglas believed, had visited Carla's grave many times to talk to her. She was likely the only person who knew his terrible secret. After 4 years, Douglas thought their killer must have gotten comfortable, believing that he'd gotten away with his crime. Digging up Carla's body would resurrect his fear of getting caught, and that could lead to a major mistake, if not a confession. Bush, Rushing, and Greer left the meeting feeling totally floored. John Douglas looked at the case that had stumped them for years, and in a matter of minutes created a psychological profile for the man who had killed Carla, and a roadmap that could lead police to him. As they drove back to Illinois, they went over their list of suspects and knew there were still several men who fit Douglas's description of the killer, including the serial rapist and Paul, the next-door neighbor. The three investigators met with the district attorney as soon as they got back to Madison County, Illinois, and the DA immediately agreed to the FBI profiler's media strategy. Over the next 2 weeks, the district attorney held a series of press conferences doling out information about the re-energized Carla Brown investigation. He played up the fact that the guy who had helped nab serial killer Ted Bundy was advising investigators. And soon, stories about the Carla Brown investigation became a regular feature in the regional newspaper for days and days. Amid the media frenzy, police received a call from a friend of Carla's next-door neighbor. 2 days after the murder, this friend hosted a party that Paul attended. He said that Paul mentioned that police had been around his place asking questions and that he might have to leave town if the heat turned up on him. The friend explained that he had kept his mouth shut about what he overheard Paul saying for almost 4 years, but he was now finally moved to call the police after he had heard the district attorney talk about the bite mark on Carla's collarbone. The friend said that back when the murder first happened, Paul had actually talked about how the killer had bit Carla. Now, this friend was starting to think that Paul might know more about the crime than he was admitting to. That got Rushing's attention. No one knew about the bite mark until Dr. Campbell discovered it in a computer-enhanced photo 2 years after the murder. Well, no one knew about it prior to that, except for the killer. On June 1st, 1982, almost 4 years after the murder, reporters from all over the St. Louis region gathered around Carla Brown's grave at the Woodlawn Cemetery. They snapped pictures of her headstone, which read, "So lovely, so loving, so loved." As the backhoe dug into the ground, Chief Greer stood shoulder to shoulder with Rushing and Bush, praying that this invasion of Carla's grave would lead them to her killer. The casket was lifted out of the ground and placed into a hearse and driven to the St. Louis Medical Examiner's office. Greer, Bush, and Rushing gathered around the casket as the coroner opened it up. The casket had been sealed well, leaving the body in very good condition. The skin had not deteriorated very much, and this time, Bush zeroed in with his camera on the bite mark. Using new high-resolution film, he snapped photograph after photograph. Now armed with much better images of this bite mark, investigators wanted to compare them with Paul's dental impression. Bush, Rushing, and Greer flew out to New York to meet with a bite mark expert. He was going to match the teeth marks on Carla's collarbone against impressions taken from several men they had spoken to over the last several years, including Paul from next door and Carla's ex-stepfather. Now, none of these bite molds were labeled by name, so this expert had no idea whose teeth were which as he did the comparison. Sitting at his kitchen table on Long Island, New York, the bite mark expert performed a blind comparison, and sure enough, he found a perfect match. Investigators now knew who killed Carla, and unbelievably, the real killer basically lined up perfectly with the profile of the killer they had gotten from Douglas. Based on all the forensic evidence and other evidence collected at the crime scene, here is what investigators believe happened to Carla on January 21st, 1978. Around 11 a.m. on that day, the killer parked his beat-up red Volkswagen vehicle at a laundromat about a block from Carla and Mark's house. As he walked from his car towards their house, he reached back and he touched his back pocket to make sure the coil of electrical cord was still there, and it was. The killer entered the house through the back door, which was unlocked. He then headed right downstairs to the basement to confront Carla. Carla recognized him and demanded to know what he was doing there, but the killer didn't explain himself. Instead, he just grabbed her and forced her onto the sofa. Carla fought back as hard as she could, but her killer was much stronger and twice her weight. The killer then kissed Carla on the face and the neck, and then bit her along the collarbone. Then he pulled off Carla's shorts, pinned her to the couch, and unzipped his jeans. It was at this point that Carla apparently screamed an insult at him, and that's when the killer snapped. Years of rejection just overtook him, triggered by Carla's taunting. He grabbed the TV tray near him and swung it as hard as he could into Carla's face, breaking her jaw. Then the killer lifted that tray back into the air and brought it down again on Carla's face, leaving that parallel gash in Carla's forehead. As Carla reeled from these blows, the killer pulled out that electrical cord from his back pocket and tied it tight around Carla's neck. And the killer pulled as tight as he could on that cord, constricting Carla's windpipe until her face turned beet red. The pressure closed off her carotid artery, depriving her brain of oxygen, and so in seconds, Carla lost consciousness. A few seconds later, the killer released the wire and sat up, and as he caught his breath, he looked around wildly, wondering what was going on, as if he'd just woken up from a nightmare. And then he looked at Carla, and he saw her lying lifeless on the sofa. Suddenly realizing what he'd just done, he panicked. He pulled the wire completely off Carla's neck, he slapped her face a few times to try to revive her, but when that didn't work, he drew some water from the sink and poured it on Carla's face, and when that failed, the killer decided to just rearrange the entire crime scene, hoping to throw off the police. Inspired by recent accounts of Ted Bundy, the killer staged Carla's body to make it look like the work of a serial killer. Then the killer wiped down all the surfaces he touched, ran up the stairs, and slipped out the back door. Then he snuck over to the house right next door and washed Carla's blood off himself before anyone realized he was there. At 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday, June 8, 1982, just days before the 4th anniversary of Carla's murder, Greer and Rushing arrested the killer at his parents' home. All these years, they had been so focused on Carla's neighbor, Paul, because he seemed suspicious and he had failed his polygraph, when the whole time, the real murderer had been Paul's best friend, John Prant. one of the two men who had been with Paul when they had tried to join Carla's party on the day she moved in. The real killer, John, had been insulted by Carla's refusal to let them inside, and so he'd come back to teach her a lesson, although he claims he had not meant to kill her. In July of 1983, John was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 75 years in prison. Despite repeated attempts to discredit the bite mark evidence on appeal, he remained behind bars for 37 and a half years until 2019 when he was freed on parole. Since then, John has engaged the help of the Exoneration Project to try to discredit the bite mark evidence and clear his name. To this day, John maintains his innocence. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts: Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014, 17-year-old Lexi Sachs was asleep in her bed inside of her parents' mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. And as she lay there, suddenly there was this loud bang on her door that woke her up. And instinctively, Lexi just pulled the covers up over her head like she did when she was a little kid and was scared. And as she lay there under her covers, she held her breath and stayed totally still, hoping the sound she had just heard was actually from her dream and not in real life. But then she heard her little brother begin to scream in the hallway. And at that point, Lexi jumped into action. She threw the covers off and ran out of her bed, out of her room, into the hall. And what she found at the end of the hallway would not only turn her and her siblings' lives totally upside down, but it would also leave one of the safest and wealthiest communities in the entire country in total shock. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please kindly rob a bank and leave clues behind that frame the Amazon Music follow button. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of February 6th, 2014, 54-year-old entrepreneur Andra Sachs lit 2 candles on top of a cake, then started singing Happy Birthday as she carried that cake out of the kitchen inside of her sprawling mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. 3 of Andra's 5 children joined in the singing and followed their mom. Andra was 5 foot 11 inches tall with dyed blonde hair, and she was the type of person who could take over any room she walked into. So even a simple chorus of Happy Birthday with her kids felt like a big production whenever Andra was leading it. As Andra, her 2 teenage daughters, and her 8-year-old son continued to sing Happy Birthday, they walked past a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Their huge 3-story house sat on top of a hill, and the windows looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Then Andra and the kids walked into the dining room, where Andra's ex-husband, Brad, was sitting at the dining room table smiling. Brad was over 6 feet tall, he had salt and pepper hair, and he almost always had a tan. Andra put the cake down on the table, and then she and the kids finished singing Happy Birthday. Brad leaned over the cake and blew out the 2 candles that were shaped like a 5 and a 7. The kids cheered, and Brad thanked them all for singing. Andra smiled at Brad, but she noticed he was hiding his hands just below the dining room table. She knew why Brad was doing it. It was because he didn't want the kids to see the tremors that were making his hands shake. 2 years earlier, Brad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a disorder of the central nervous system that can include symptoms like muscle stiffness, loss of balance, and tremors. And recently, Brad's symptoms had gotten worse. The kids knew their dad was dealing with Parkinson's, and so they were used to the changes in his movement that the disease could cause. But that night, Brad was celebrating his 57th birthday, and he just wanted the kids to have a good time and not worry about him. So he kept his hands out of sight while Andra cut up pieces of the cake and handed them out to the kids. Then Andra sat down next to Brad at the table, and she rubbed his back. Andra watched the kids laughing and eating their cake. Then she told Brad she wished their 2 oldest sons, who were away at college, could have come home to visit for his birthday so the whole family could be together. Brad said it was all right, and he pointed out that before they knew it, the girls would go off to college, and their 8-year-old boy would grow up, and it would just be the 2 of them together most of the time, like it had been at the beginning of their relationship. Andra and Brad had met almost 25 years earlier when they were both starting out as entrepreneurs in the growing tech industry. They were both very smart, and they had great minds for business, but other than that, they seemed like they didn't have much in common. Andra had grown up without a lot of money. In fact, there had been times as a child when her parents struggled just to make mortgage payments. As she got older, Andra had told herself she never wanted to experience anything like that when she was out on her own. So after she earned a business degree in college, she had worked hard to develop her sales skills and to learn about as many industries as she could in the hope that she would always have job security. Andra was full of energy, she could talk to anybody, and she could be intimidating. And those traits had helped her find success as a salesperson at a pretty young age. But Andra was also driven and fixated on success. So she had wanted to be her own boss and to make even more money. So by the time Andra had met Brad, she was already formulating plans to start and run her own company. Brad had first seen this tall, stunning, laser-focused woman at a computer convention back in 1990, and he was totally floored by her. Unlike Andra, Brad had come from money. He was the son of a legendary Southern California surfer, and Brad had wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. So he'd spent a big part of his life traveling and surfing waves on beaches all over the world. And Brad embraced the laid-back surfer attitude. He almost never raised his voice, he never looked like he was in a hurry to get anywhere, and nothing really seemed to stress him out. And so when Andra and Brad had met, it really was a case of opposites attracting. Brad had been drawn to Andra's drive and energy, and Andra had been drawn to Brad's kind of quiet, calm demeanor. The two had gotten married a year after they met, and they'd started a family soon after that. They had their first son, Miles, and he was followed 2 years later by his brother, Ashton. Then, a few years after that, Andra and Brad's first daughter, Lexi, was born. In the dining room, Andra and Brad watched 17-year-old Lexi gather up wrapped birthday presents with her 8-year-old brother, Landon. Andra appreciated that Lexi went out of her way to take care of her little brother because Andra spent a lot of time working and she wasn't always around. And as Brad's Parkinson's progressed, it was more difficult for him to do certain things around the house and to look after Landon all the time. But there was something about watching Lexi with Landon that always made Brad and Andra a little sad. It wasn't the kids' fault, but seeing them together brought up memories of the worst time in Brad and Andra's lives. Less than a year after Lexi had been born, Andra and Brad had welcomed another daughter, and as their family grew, their businesses had grown alongside it. Andra and Brad had started multiple companies together and also separately on their own. Then, Andra had used some of the profits from one of her companies to invest in rental properties and to build a massive real estate portfolio. In her time as an entrepreneur, Andra had often said it was easy to make money, but keeping it was the hard part. So she saw real estate as a way to protect her and her family's money and to build on the wealth that she had started to make from her other businesses. It turned out that Andra was a very savvy real estate investor, and soon after getting into that business, her investment properties were bringing in millions of dollars. So Andra, who had been determined never to face the financial struggles her parents had gone through, felt like she had already accomplished more than she could have hoped for. She was making more money than she had ever imagined, and she and Brad had just bought their first house together. It was a modest house compared to the mansion on the hill they would move into years later, but it had a beautiful pool and also had a hot tub. And the happiest part of Andra's life was that she and Brad had 2 perfect sons and 2 perfect daughters. But on a day in 1999, 15 years before Brad's family birthday party, 2-year-old Lexi and her 16-month-old sister had been at home with a nanny while Andra and Brad were working, and the two boys were at school. While the nanny fed the baby in her high chair, Lexi had walked out of the house into the backyard and onto the deck by the pool and the hot tub. Inside the house, the nanny had seen Lexi out the window, so she grabbed the baby from the high chair and rushed outside. Lexi was close to the pool, and the nanny panicked. She put the baby down on the deck and then reached out and grabbed Lexi. But when the nanny had grabbed Lexi, the baby had somehow fallen off the deck into the hot tub and drowned. Following the death of their youngest child, Andra and Brad felt like everything they built together had just been destroyed. It didn't take long for them to start blaming each other for what had happened, and the tensions at home spilled into their work, and pretty soon each of them had tried to push the other one out of the businesses they owned together, and their marriage fell apart. Andra and Brad had gotten divorced, but things had only gotten worse from there. They had sued each other over business assets and personal finances, and Andra had even filed a report with police stating that Brad had tried to physically assault her. During this time, their 3 living children, Miles, Ashton, and Lexi, had clung to each other for support and tried to make both of their parents happy. Miles, the oldest, had seen himself as the one in charge, the one who was responsible for taking care of his younger siblings, and the other kids followed Miles's lead. But only a couple of years after the ugly divorce, Andra and Brad reconciled. Their friends and family had been shocked, but Andra and Brad seemed happy, and they had moved into the mansion on the hill in San Juan Capistrano that Andra had bought with money from her real estate investments. So the family was back together again. And then Andra and Brad had expanded the family by adopting Landon and his older sister. But after the divorce, Andra had sworn she would never share her money with Brad again, so she and Brad had not gotten remarried, and the house and most of the family's assets were still under Andra's name. In the dining room, Lexi and Landon brought in one final birthday present for Brad. It wasn't wrapped, but it had a bow on it, and when Brad saw it, he lit up. It was a large water bicycle designed to let him ride the ocean waves while sitting on top of it. Parkinson's disease had taken surfing away from Brad, but now, with this water bicycle, he'd be able to get back in the water. He thanked the kids for the great birthday party, then he turned to Andra, gave her a kiss, and thanked her for the incredible gift. They both knew a lot of people did not understand their relationship, an ex-husband and wife living together without getting remarried or sharing their money, but they didn't care, because Andra and Brad believed that they and their kids were as happy, successful, and loving as a family could be. On February 8th, 2014, so 2 nights after the birthday party, Andra helped Brad to their bedroom on the 3rd floor of the house. They hadn't told their younger kids yet, but Andra had recently purchased a new 1-story property, and she was going to sell the home they lived in. Andra and Brad knew the kids would be disappointed to move out of the mansion on top of the hill, but it was getting too hard for Brad to deal with the size of the house and to navigate all the stairs, and so Andra wanted a place where he could get to everything he needed on just 1 floor. While Andra and Brad went to their bedroom, 17-year-old Lexi walked into her little brother Landon's room on the 3rd floor and said goodnight to him as he got ready for bed. Then Lexi and her 15-year-old sister played with the family dogs and talked about school for a little bit before Lexi headed to her own bedroom, which was just down the hall from her brother's. Lexi got dressed for bed, she laid down, she looked at her phone and sent a couple of text messages to friends. After a while, she put her phone on the bedside table, flipped off the lamp, and then went to sleep. A few hours later, at about 1:45 in the morning, Lexi woke up, startled. She thought she heard a loud noise coming from down the hall, but she didn't know if it was real or if maybe she'd been dreaming. Then, Lexi heard something bang against her bedroom door, and the door flew open. Without thinking, Lexi immediately held her breath and pulled the covers up over her head, like she had done when she was a kid when she got scared. She heard a loud noise, but obviously couldn't see it, and then something smashed into the wall just above her. Lexi tried her best just to be totally still and not make a sound, but then she heard footsteps running down the hallway, followed by her little brother Landon screaming. Hearing her brother calling out made Lexi jump into action. She threw the covers off of her, she got out of her bed, ran into the hallway, and she saw Landon lying on his chest a few feet outside of his bedroom in the hallway, and he was screaming and crying and saying he couldn't feel his legs. Then Lexi heard footsteps again coming from behind her, and immediately her body tensed up. But then she turned around and saw it was just her sister running towards her. Lexi yelled for her sister to go call 911, so her sister turned around and ran back to her room on the second floor to get her phone and make the call. Lexi turned around and looked down at Landon and promised him he would be just fine and that she needed to go somewhere, but she'd be right back. And then she turned and ran down the hall towards her parents' room. And when Lexi got inside, her screams carried across the entire house. "45 minutes later, at about 2:30 in the morning, Detectives Justin Montano and Mike Thompson of the Orange County Sheriff's Department drove past a set of large palm trees as they headed up the hill towards Andra and Brad's house. The house was surrounded by a wall with a gate, but the gate was open. Detective Montano drove through the open gate, and he and Thompson saw an ambulance and several squad cars parked out front. The detectives stepped out of their car and looked up at the 3-story mansion. Both of these detectives had handled cases in similar Orange County neighborhoods, but they were still taken aback by some of these huge multi-million-dollar properties like the Saxes house. Montano and Thompson made their way up to the mansion and walked inside. One of the first officers who had arrived at the scene met them and led them through the foyer to a large staircase and up to the 3rd floor. Montano and Thompson walked down the 3rd floor hallway past Lexi's bedroom, and they saw members of the forensics team examining spots of blood on the floor outside of Landon's room. The detectives followed the officer to the main bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was open, so before they even stepped into the room, they could see inside, and they could see there was blood covering the back wall. And they could see there were 2 bodies still lying in the bed. They were Andra and Brad, and they both were deceased. Montano thanked the officer for leading them to the bedroom, and then he and Thompson stepped into the room and walked towards the bed. Neither of them could get over the amount of blood that was covering the sheets. Montano thought this looked more like a gangland hit than a typical homicide. A ballistics expert waved the detectives over and showed them multiple bullet casings he'd already found in the room, but there was no murder weapon left at the scene. Montano went back to the officer who had led them to the bedroom and asked him what he and the paramedics had found when they first entered the house. The officer said the victims' 3 children who lived in this house had all gathered in the hallway right outside of their parents' bedroom. The officer said it appeared that the 2 teenage girls were okay, but the 8-year-old boy had lost feeling and movement from the waist down. All 3 kids have been taken to the hospital. Montano nodded and thanked the officer again for his help. Then Montano and Thompson looked at the scene on the bed again, and for some reason they both had the same thought. Did the 2 teenage girls murder their parents and maybe paralyze their little brother in the process? The idea of that upset both detectives, but they couldn't rule it out. The detectives had a theory that the motive for most murders boiled down to one of 3 things: money, sex, or revenge. And in a mansion like this, in such a wealthy neighborhood, there was definitely a chance that the kids had gone after their parents to maybe get their money. So after spending hours at the crime scene and organizing a canvass of the neighborhood, Montano and Thompson decided to really begin their investigation by talking to the Sachs children. That morning, a few hours after Andra and Brad's bodies had been discovered, their 19-year-old son, Ashton, was sitting on his couch playing a video game inside of his 1-bedroom condo in Seattle, Washington. Ashton was lanky, with straight brown hair that hung down over his forehead. It was a Sunday afternoon, and one of Ashton's favorite things to do on Sundays was to sit on his couch, smoke a little pot, and play the video game League of Legends for hours on end. And so he was doing that when his phone rang on the coffee table, and he glanced down from the TV and he saw it was his older brother, Miles, calling him. So Ashton paused his game and he answered his phone. The 2 brothers both lived in Washington, but they attended colleges on opposite sides of the state, so they didn't get to hang out very much. But they still made it a point to check in with each other fairly frequently, and they got along reasonably well, even though they were not really alike. Miles, who was 21 years old, had always been seen by his siblings as the golden boy of the family, and he definitely took after his mom when it came to business. Miles was already managing some of his mother's real estate properties in Washington, and he had dreams of starting his own company someday, just like his parents had done. Ashton was way more into computers than he was into business, so he'd gone to college in Seattle to study computer science, and he hoped he'd be able to get into a tech or gaming company when he was a bit older. When Ashton put the phone to his ear, he heard Miles's voice cracking on the other end, and he couldn't understand anything Miles was saying. Ashton asked Miles to slow down and to tell him what was going on. Then Miles, somewhat point-blank, told Ashton that their parents had been found murdered, their brother was now in the hospital and couldn't feel his lower half, and their sisters were now talking to the police. Ashton just sat there in silence for a second. Then Miles told him he needed to fly home immediately and help take care of their younger siblings. Ashton had always seen Miles as the leader among the Sachs children. After all, Miles was the oldest and their parents had always trusted him, so Ashton, who was clearly in shock, said he would do whatever Miles thought was the right thing to do. Later that day, Miles and Ashton both flew from Washington to Orange County, California, and after they both arrived, they immediately went to the hospital to check on their brother, who was still in recovery, and then they reached out to the police. Several hours after they had arrived in Orange County, Miles and Ashton, the two oldest Sachs children, sat down in an office at the sheriff's station to talk to Detectives Montano and Thompson. Miles was significantly taller than his brother Ashton. He wore a dress shirt and slacks, and he had brown curly hair. Earlier that day, Montano and Thompson had talked to the boys' sisters, and they still considered them suspects, but police didn't have any evidence to hold them at that point. So the boys had gotten to see their sisters earlier, which made them feel a bit better than they had when they had left Washington. At the sheriff's station, Miles and Ashton looked like they were doing their best to hold everything together. But Montano and Thompson could tell, underneath their kind of tough exterior, they both seemed exhausted, and the detectives had no idea what they were going through after all they were hit with that day. So the detectives started by thanking the brothers for coming in, and then they gently asked them, where they had been when the rest of the family was at the house. Miles and Ashton explained that they had been in Washington, where they both went to college. Then Montano asked the brothers if they could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against their parents. Miles and Ashton looked at each other, and Miles nodded, and Ashton nodded back. It was like one of those moments where siblings can say a lot to each other without actually saying anything. Miles took a breath and then looked at Detective Montano and said there was a long list of people who had it out for their parents. A look of surprise came across both detectives' faces. In the short time they'd been working this case, everybody the police had talked to made it sound like Andra and Brad were very well liked and admired by just about everyone. But Miles said that just wasn't the case. He told detectives that his mother's very aggressive way of doing business had led her to make a lot of money and a lot of enemies over the years. There were investors who felt like Andra had cheated them out of money, there were clients who felt like she had ripped them off, and there were tenants in some of the rental properties Andra owned who believed she was an evil landlord. Miles thought most of the people who were angry at his mom were really just jealous of her success, or that they didn't understand how business worked. But once those people believed Andra had wronged them in some way, there was just no changing their minds. Then Montano asked if Miles or Ashton could name any particular person that was one of Andra and Brad's potential enemies. And Ashton said they would actually need a couple pieces of paper to be able to list everybody. By the end of the interview, Miles and Ashton had provided police with 2 pages filled with the names of previous business associates and renters who might have wanted to harm their parents. So detectives Montano and Thompson immediately went back to their theory that most murders are about money, sex, or revenge. Their first instinct had been that one of the Sachs kids might have wanted to get their parents money, and so that was why they attacked them. But now, looking at all these names on these 2 pages, the detectives started to think that it was very likely that Brad and Andra might have been killed by someone who was out for revenge. In the days following Andra and Brad's murders, Montano and Thompson learned that the murder weapon had been a Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle. So part of the investigative team focused on tracking down that weapon in the hope it would lead them to the killer. During that time, Montano and Thompson concentrated on the list of people that Miles and Ashton had provided them. And as they did this, the detectives discovered that there was even more anger towards Andra and Brad than their sons may have even realized. While searching social media, the detectives found multiple posts from people celebrating Andra and Brad's deaths. Most of the people posting were disgruntled renters who had lived in properties that Andra owned. So Montano added all those people who were making posts like that to their list of suspects and started to work through that list. But out of all the people they had looked into, from social media to the lists of names the brothers had given them, one group of people in particular stood out to the detectives. They were board members who had worked with Andra and Brad at one of the first successful companies they had started together. It turned out that years earlier, the board of directors had kicked Andra out of her own company because they said her business tactics and what they called her destructive raging were damaging the business. Andra had not left without a fight, and she had threatened to sue everybody involved with the company. And so finally, the board had just given her a payout of $9 million to walk away quietly. But when the company had faced bankruptcy, the board had started going after Andra in court to get the company's $9 million back. So Montano and Thompson saw these board members as people who wanted both money and revenge. The detectives met with individuals from the board, and they almost all said the same thing. They thought Andra was a terrible person to do business with, but they were horrified by what happened to her and her husband and her son. Those interviews also led to a list of even more past business associates who had grievances with Andra and Brad. And so Montana and Thompson felt like they really were just swimming in names of potential suspects, and they still hadn't even ruled out Brad and Andra's daughters. The investigative team was willing to methodically go through the entire suspect list if necessary, but Montano and Thompson believed if they could just track down the murder weapon, they could propel the investigation forward a lot faster. So they started to delve into the cell phone records of everybody they thought could possibly be connected to the murders. And they caught what looked like a huge break. A cell phone call had been placed from a car driving on the street at the bottom of the hill just outside of Brad and Andra's mansion around the same time the murders had taken place. But, just like the murder weapon, the car that the phone call had been made from seemed to have vanished. About a week after Andra and Brad's murders, 4 of their 5 kids, so all the siblings minus Landon, who was in the hospital, stood huddled together at the front of a church in between their parents' coffins. Over the past several days, those 4 siblings had barely left each other's sides, and they had spent most of their time with their little brother, Landon, in his hospital room, until they had finally gotten the good news that Landon was going to live. However, doctors said he would not walk again. At the funeral, Miles, the oldest sibling, spoke first about his unique relationship with his mother. He called her Andra and not Mom because he felt the connection they shared went beyond that of just mother and son. They were also friends and business partners, and Andra had always treated him as an equal. After Miles spoke, he went back over to his sisters and wrapped his arms around them. He was much, much taller than both of them, and so it almost looked, as they were standing there, like Miles was their father and not their brother. Then Ashton, the other brother, stepped forward and took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and as he read the eulogy from this piece of paper, you could see his hands shaking. Ashton spoke about how lucky he had been to have parents like Andra and Brad, but for most of the time that Ashton spoke, he spent his time talking about his little brother, Landon, and how whoever had done this had robbed an 8-year-old boy of the chance to grow up with a mom and dad, and how they had also robbed him of the use of his legs. It was just so tragic. After Ashton had finished talking, people in the church were openly sobbing as they offered condolences to all the kids. And even though those people knew the family had money, they wondered who would take care of the kids, and how they would ever move on from what had just happened to their parents. In the days following the funeral, the other Sachs siblings began to notice a change come over Miles. It was like he stopped being a normal older brother and switched into business mode like they had seen their mom do before. Miles met with authorities so that he and Ashton could obtain legal guardianship over their younger siblings, Then he moved all of the kids out of the mansion on the hill and into that one-story home Andra had bought with the intention of making Brad's life a bit easier. The other kids were angry about the move, but Miles said it was the right financial choice to make. This way, he could complete the sale of the mansion like his mom had intended, and the family would make millions of dollars. The kids were confused and upset, but they'd always looked up to Miles, and he seemed to have a clear plan, and he assured them that everything he was doing was in their best interest. So, in the span of a couple weeks, the Sachs kids had lost and buried their parents, and had moved out of their beloved house, and the younger kids had started having to answer to their own older brother, Miles, as if he was their parent. While Miles tried to get the family situated in their new home, he also reached out to his parents' lawyers to make sure he would have control of Andra's rental properties. Again, Miles said everything he was doing was just to make sure the rest of the kids would be taken care of and that they wouldn't have to worry about their financial futures now that their parents were gone. But even some of the kids' aunts and uncles thought Miles's behavior following the death of his parents was very bizarre. They understood that he did have a lot in common with Andra when it came to doing business, just being really aggressive and straightforward, but it almost seemed like he had already moved on from grieving, which just seemed impossible. Miles's actions didn't go unnoticed by police either, so Montano and Thompson returned to the idea that maybe money had been the motive for murder, and they wondered if maybe Miles had killed his parents just to get a hold of their financial assets and their companies. But Miles and also his brother Ashton's alibis had both checked out. People had seen them both in Washington on the morning of the murders. So Montano and Thompson just kept pursuing the two pieces of evidence that they thought would break the case wide open: the Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle used in the murders, and the car that someone had placed a call from just outside of the mansion at the time of the murders. About 3 weeks into the investigation, Montano and Thompson were sitting together at the sheriff's station reviewing the steps they had taken so far. They were still pursuing every lead they had, including the seemingly countless number of enemies that Andra and Brad had made over their years of doing business. Just then, Montano's phone rang. He picked it up, and a member of the investigative team was on the other line, and the officer sounded excited. He said cell phone records had finally led them to a man who was in possession of the car that phone call outside of the Sachs house had been made from. Montano hung up, and the police got right to work securing a warrant to search the car that investigators had just tracked down. When the warrant came through, Montano and Thompson and other members of the team went to do a full search of the car. And when police popped the trunk of that car, they found a pile of clothes and also a Ruger semi-automatic rifle inside. They now knew who had murdered Andra and Brad. Based on cell phone records, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence found at the scene of the crime and in that car, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened when somebody murdered Brad and Andra Sachs in the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014. At 1:30 a.m. on February 9th, the killer drove their white Toyota Prius slowly down the road at the bottom of the hill right below Andra and Brad's mansion. The Prius didn't make much noise, but the killer didn't really need to worry about being heard or seen anyway, because the Sachs' mansion was totally secluded, and it sat on an acre of land, so nobody really lived that close to them. The killer parked the Prius at the bottom of the hill and stepped outside. There was a light, cool breeze coming off the ocean, and it was a very mild 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The killer wore jeans, a t-shirt, and gloves, and they had a knit hat pulled down almost to their eyes. The killer then walked around their car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a loaded Ruger semi-automatic rifle with a sling on it. The killer slung the rifle over his shoulder, closed the trunk, and then began walking up the hill towards the mansion. The moonlight shone through the palm trees, and the killer could hear waves crashing on the beach nearby. Everything felt so calm, but the killer's heart was pounding in their chest. The killer reached the top of the hill and came to the wall that surrounded the front of the house. The killer stretched out their arms and grabbed the top of the wall and then pulled themselves up and climbed over it into the front yard. The porch was lit, but the rest of the house looked dark. The killer stayed low and ran to the front door. They opened the door and walked into the large foyer in the front of the house. The huge windows allowed enough light into the house for the killer to clearly see the staircase leading up to the third floor. But the killer didn't move. Instead, they just stood there silently for several minutes. And then the killer began to pace around the first floor, deciding what to do next. Finally, after the killer had been on the first floor for nearly 15 minutes, they took a deep breath, they unslung their rifle, and marched upstairs to the third floor. The killer walked quickly down the hallway of the third floor towards the main bedroom. They hesitated when they reached the closed bedroom door. But after taking a breath to steady themselves, the killer reached down with one hand, they opened the door, they stepped into the open doorway, raised their rifle, and began to fire. Bullets riddled Andra and Brad while they slept, and blood spattered the walls and soaked the sheets. The killer had fired almost 25 bullets into the room before they stepped back out of the doorway. But when the killer stopped shooting Andra and Brad and they turned around, they saw a little boy running the opposite way down the hall. So the killer just raised the rifle again and fired off 2 shots, and the boy fell to the ground. Then the killer walked further down the hall, past the boy who was now writhing in pain on the ground, and came to another closed door. They kicked the door open and fired a shot blindly into the dark room. That bullet struck the wall just above the bed where 17-year-old Lexi was hiding under the covers. Then the killer heard the little boy he had shot screaming in the hall right behind him, so the killer just slung the gun on their back again, ran down the hall, and flew down the stairs. The killer reached the first floor, their head was pounding, their ears were ringing, and they were out of breath. But they heard movement on the floors above them, so they ran out the front door and across the yard. They reached the wall, pulled themselves up, and climbed over it. Then they ran down the hill back to their car. The killer opened the trunk, took the rifle off their back, and chucked it inside. They pulled off their knit hat as well and tossed it in with the gun. Then they took off all their clothes and chucked them in the trunk, and then grabbed some fresh clothes from the trunk and put those on. Then the killer hopped into the driver's seat of the Prius, started up the engine, and hit the gas. Then, as they were driving away from the house, the killer grabbed their cell phone from the passenger seat and made a quick call. The killer's head was still pounding, and they still felt like they couldn't breathe, but they knew their night was not over yet. So the killer tried to focus. They drove across town to an apartment building and pulled the Prius into a parking garage. They parked, got out of the car, and then walked a few minutes towards a major street nearby and found a cab waiting for them. The killer climbed inside, and the cab drove them to the airport. Hours later, at about 10 a.m., the killer landed in Washington State. They caught a cab at the airport and drove home. When they got home, they made sure their neighbors physically saw them, and they also texted one of their closest friends in the area just to make a show that they were in Washington and not in California. Then the killer headed inside of their place, sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and started playing League of Legends. 19-year-old Ashton Sachs had murdered his parents, he had shot and paralyzed his little brother Landon, and fired a gun into his sister Lexi's room that easily could have hit her. It turned out Ashton had always deeply resented the way his parents treated his older brother, Miles. Ashton felt like Miles was treated like the golden boy, and his parents treated him, Ashton, like a failure. And that resentment had festered for years until Ashton started to consider murdering his parents in cold blood. Ashton went so far as to do serious research into different types of weapons and to figure out the differences between first and second-degree murder. Then Ashton had gone out and actually bought a semi-automatic rifle. But even after he'd gotten the gun, Ashton still wasn't sure he could actually go through with killing his mom and dad. He felt like he hated them, and he blamed them for a lot of his shortcomings, but he just didn't know if he could actually pull the trigger and end their lives. But then, the day after Brad's 57th birthday, Andra had texted Ashton to tell him how disappointed she was that he hadn't even called to wish his father a happy birthday. Ashton, very sarcastically, said that he only forgot it was his dad's birthday because his dad had forgotten he had a second son a long time ago. This led to an argument between Ashton and Andra, and Ashton finally decided at the end of that argument to go through with his plan. On the day before the murders, Ashton had driven his white Prius 18 hours from Seattle to San Juan Capistrano, California. He waited patiently in town for a few more hours, and then he carried out the murders in the early morning. Ashton had arranged for a cab to meet him and take him to the airport, and for a transportation company to drive the Prius back to Seattle and to keep it for him until he was ready to pick it up. So, immediately after the murders, he called that transportation company to verify the address where he would leave the car for them. Then he had dropped the car off in that parking garage, met the cab, and flew home. And it was that phone call to the transportation company that he made right after killing his parents that led police to Ashton. Using cell phone data, they tracked down the owner of the transportation company, and they learned that he had Ashton's white Prius in his possession. Then the search of Ashton's car led police to the murder weapon. When police had initially questioned Ashton, they believed he had been in Seattle on the morning following the murder. But the discovery of the Prius undercut that alibi and made it clear that he would have had time to commit the murders and fly home by the time he had been seen in Seattle. But before police arrested Ashton, they wanted to make sure they had an airtight case that would lead to a conviction. So they dug deeper into his life. It turned out that Ashton had dropped out of college without telling any of his family, and that he had started to isolate himself from most of the people around him. Police also searched his internet history and found all the research on weapons and the different degrees of murder and what each one means, and so police believed they had more than enough evidence against him. When police arrested Ashton, it didn't take long for him to confess. But he made it clear that he had not just killed his parents because he thought they liked Miles better than him. Ashton said his parents had always made him feel like he was weak. He said dating back to the time when he was just a little kid and his baby sister had drowned in the hot tub, his parents didn't seem to care about how upset he was, or even try to get him some help to deal with the grief he was going through. And then, not long before the actual murders, Ashton had gone through this very bad breakup with his girlfriend and gotten really depressed, and he had tried to take his own life by overdosing on painkillers. And Ashton said he felt like his parents didn't really even care. While the other children had a totally different view of Andra and Brad, Ashton felt like murdering his parents was his way of getting revenge on them for all the times they'd made him feel unimportant. Ashton was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100-year sentence for what the court referred to as special circumstances surrounding the use of firearms. As of 2022, Miles, the oldest sibling, was still looking after his younger siblings like he was their parent. And now at 17 years old, Landon, who was paralyzed from being shot, became one of the top 20 wheelchair tennis players in the entire United States, and he hopes one day he'll be able to compete at Wimbledon. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, that has many more stories just like this one, but a lot of them are only on YouTube. Again, that YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. Okay, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for your support. See ya. On a Monday afternoon in December of 2001, a pair of police officers walked in the side door of a big old farmhouse in the woods in Loudoun County, Virginia. They had just received a frantic 911 call from a man who said he had found his neighbor horrifically injured on the kitchen floor. The police officers crept through the house, peering cautiously around corners in case the attacker was still in the house. But, other than the sound of their footsteps creaking on the hardwood, the home was totally silent. When they made it to the kitchen, they stopped. There, lying on his stomach, was the body of an older man, covered in blood. One of the officers stepped forward and knelt down to check the man's pulse, but it was obvious to both of them that he was dead. The officer was about to stand back up when something strange on the back of the man's neck caught his eye. Slowly, the officer reached out a hand and pulled down the collar of the man's shirt. When he saw what was there, he looked back at his partner with an expression of fear, because what he had just discovered could be a sign that there were devil-worshipping occultists prowling their rural community. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please take the follow button on a camping trip and leave them way off the hiking trail before setting up camp for the night. After dark, once the follow button has gone to sleep, secretly pack up all of your gear and leave the follow button completely alone in the middle of nowhere. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 8, 2001, 57-year-old Dr. Robert Schwartz stood in the kitchen of his farmhouse outside of Leesburg, Virginia, stirring strips of pork and vegetables in his frying pan. Robert could hear the rain beating against the windows, and the sound made him feel at peace. He had the heat cranked up, and he was wearing his most comfortable sweatpants. There was nowhere he would rather be on a rainy winter night than inside this home, which had been in his wife's family for generations. He checked the pork, which was almost done, and he reached for a single plate out of the cabinet. Robert used to love cooking, and until just a few years ago, he always made big portions to feed his family of 5. But his wife had died 4 years earlier from cancer, and her death had sent all 3 of their kids spiraling, especially their youngest, Clara, who was only 15 at the time. Clara was the one who actually found her mom on the morning she died, and she had fallen into a deep depression afterwards. Robert had been worried he might never pull her out. But recently, Clara seemed to have gotten into a really good groove. She was 19 now, and she had found a tight-knit group of friends who all loved Renaissance fairs, where people dress up like they're from medieval times. Clara had created a fantasy game called Underworld, and the kids all spent a lot of time playing it. Robert didn't really understand the game, but he was thrilled that Clara had finally discovered something to be passionate about. These days, Clara was away at college, along with her older sister, Michelle, and her older brother, Jesse. And Robert was proud of how he had pulled the kids through their mother's death. He felt like he had sent them out into the world as basically happy and capable people, which was a goal that had seemed very far away in the early period of their grief. He did miss them, though. Most nights now, he ate alone, with the creaking of the old house to keep him company. His kids had always complained about all the noises the house made, but Robert liked it. He spent his days working long hours as a biophysicist studying DNA at a science and technology firm called the Center for Innovative Technology, where the offices and laboratories were white and brightly lit and pretty quiet. Robert loved his work, but the environment was a little sterile for his taste. So, coming home to an overgrown farmhouse way out in the woods, where vines grew up the stone walls and the floorboards squeaked and the nearest neighbors were more than a quarter mile away, was a nice contrast. Now, he set his plate down and reached into a bag of tortillas on the counter. He put 2 in the middle of the plate, and then he started to tip the frying pan to scoop out the meat and vegetables on top. But before he could turn off the burner and head to the table, he heard a knock coming from the front door. Robert frowned and craned his neck to look toward the door, which had a little window in it, but the rain made it impossible to see out. Robert did not get a lot of unexpected visitors, especially not on a stormy night like this, but he figured maybe it was just a delivery driver trying to keep a package from getting soaked. But whoever it was knocked again, and so Robert turned and walked out of the kitchen and through the front room toward the entryway. The knocking had gotten fast and loud by the time Robert made it to the front door, flipped the lock, and swung the door open. Two days later, on December 10th, 2001, at around 1:15 on Monday afternoon, a man named Sam Welsh, who lived down the street from Robert Schwartz, was loading laundry into his washing machine when his phone rang. Sam abandoned the laundry and walked into his kitchen to pick it up. When he said hello, he heard the voice of a friend, and his friend sounded pretty anxious. This friend worked at the Center for Innovative Technology, which is where Robert worked, and the friend said that Robert hadn't come into work today. He had missed an important meeting, and he wasn't answering his phone. And this was about as out of character as it was possible to get for Robert, who was famous in the field of DNA research and had actually worked on the first online database of DNA sequence information. Robert was organized, reliable, and extremely communicative. He never just went silent. So this friend asked Sam, "Can you please go to Robert's house to check to see if he's okay?" Sam didn't hesitate. He said of course he would. Then he hung up the phone, went out to his truck, and drove to Robert's farmhouse, which was about a mile away at the end of a dead-end road. When Sam pulled up, he saw Robert's car parked on the street, and a construction crew digging up Robert's driveway in front of the house. Everything looked calm and normal, which Sam found encouraging. He recognized one of the workers as another neighbor of his, so he parked his truck, hopped out, and went over to ask if the worker had seen Robert. But the worker said no. The construction crew had arrived almost 6 hours earlier at 7:30 that morning, and not only had Robert not come out to greet them all like he normally did, they hadn't actually seen any movement at all inside of his house. Now, the brief sense of relief Sam had felt when he arrived evaporated. He explained to the construction worker about the concerning call he'd just gotten, and so he asked the worker to come with him to go check on Robert. The two men walked down the driveway toward the farmhouse. They knocked on the front door, but nobody answered. So they went around to the side door, which Sam knew Robert usually left unlocked. Sam didn't want to just barge in, so when they got to the side door, he first knocked loudly. But again, nobody answered. Sam shot a worried look at the construction worker, and then he tried the knob. And just like he'd expected, the door was unlocked. Sam stepped inside and called out Robert's name, but the house was completely silent. So he took a few halting steps. Ahead of him, he could see the kitchen. Sam called out Robert's name again and took one more step forward, right up to the threshold of the kitchen, and then he froze. For a long second, Sam stood there completely still, not even breathing, with the construction worker a few paces behind him. Then, Sam whirled around and gave the worker a shove back towards the door. Sam was so afraid that he could barely think, but he managed to shout one single sentence: "Call the police!" Loudoun County investigator Greg Locke was sitting in a classroom in a local school near Leesburg, Virginia, halfway through his first day of a week-long police training course when his pager vibrated. And when Locke looked down at the short message blinking on his little screen, he felt his heart start to race. He stood up and gathered his things, told the instructor he was sorry but he had to go, then speed-walked out of the classroom. Locke had only been with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department for a couple of months. He had originally planned on becoming a firefighter, but training for that position had required that he go to the local police academy. And in the police academy, Locke had realized that he actually preferred the slow, puzzle-solving nature of detective work over the fast-paced intensity of firefighting. So he had switched careers entirely and joined the sheriff's department. He started off in the crime lab, but he just transferred to the homicide unit, which was actually why he was taking this class. Now, Investigator Locke pushed open the front door of the school building where his class was happening and jogged the rest of the distance to his cruiser. He got in, turned the ignition, and peeled out of the parking lot, headed west toward the big old farmhouse in the woods. When Locke pulled up on the dead-end street, he saw the flashing blue and white lights of a sea of police cruisers. It looked like the entire sheriff's department was there. Locke got out of his cruiser and walked down the long driveway and up the front steps of the farmhouse. The front door was open, and as Locke stepped through the entryway, he could tell that the scene was pretty well covered by police and crime scene techs. So he looked for a supervisor to get a rundown of exactly what they were dealing with. Locke found his supervisor standing just outside the kitchen, staring grimly at a man's bloody body. At first glance, it was immediately clear to Locke that whatever had happened here to this man, it had been a frenzy of violence. The man's body lay face down on the floor. His clothing had been shredded in the attack, and there was so much blood that it had dried in sticky thick pools that spread out all over the hardwood. Even the bottom of the man's white socks were bloody, which Locke knew meant there must have been a struggle, because the only way for the bottom of his socks to get that soaked was if he had been bleeding heavily and then stepped in it. Locke's supervisor turned away from the body and brought Locke quickly up to speed. Their victim was Dr. Robert Schwartz, who was a well-known biophysicist, and he had been stabbed to death. It didn't appear to be a robbery, because nothing had been stolen or rifled through, and there was no sign of forced entry, which meant that very likely Robert had opened the door to his attacker willingly. Locke knew that a set of facts like this often meant that a murder victim had been targeted by a person they knew, rather than attacked by a random stranger, and the savagery of the stabbing itself supported that theory. because it suggested a highly emotional killer who felt true rage towards the victim. But Locke's supervisor told him there was one more thing, something incredibly bizarre. Whoever had stabbed Dr. Schwartz to death had also carved an X into the back of his neck. Locke told his supervisor that he was going to start canvassing the neighborhood, and his supervisor nodded in agreement. As Locke walked back out the front door of the farmhouse, he looked around and shook his head incredulously. This was a beautiful area. It was up in the mountains, and it was sitting right above a historic little downtown district with nice restaurants and breweries and coffee shops and a vibrant art scene. It was very hard to imagine any murder taking place here, let alone some kind of ritual killing that involved a vicious knife attack and a symbol carved into the victim's skin. The nearest house was way down the road, and as Locke reached it and climbed the front steps, he realized he couldn't even see Robert's home from here. This gave him a sinking feeling. He was afraid that the people inside of this house could not have possibly heard anything going on inside of Robert's house a quarter-mile away. None of the neighbors could have. But Locke knocked anyway, and soon a middle-aged married couple answered, looking concerned. They said they had seen all the commotion, and they asked if everything was okay. Inspector Locke just shook his head and said no. There had been an incident, but he couldn't say anything about it right now. Locke told the couple that what he had come for was to ask if they had seen or heard anything suspicious over the weekend. He watched as the couple exchanged a look. Yes, the husband said. As a matter of fact, they did. On Saturday night, during the rainstorm, a soaking wet teenage boy had come to their house asking to use the phone because his car got stuck in the mud a little ways down the road. The husband said he had looked outside and seen the car, which had a young woman and man inside, and then he said he called a towing company that he knew, and the teenager had thanked him and gone back to the car to wait, and the tow truck driver had arrived not long after. Locke scribbled this down in his notepad, then asked the husband what exactly was strange about the encounter. It wasn't uncommon at all in an area this rural for cars to get stuck. The husband nodded in agreement, but it wasn't the car getting stuck that was strange, he said. It was where the car was driving in the first place. The teenagers had gotten stuck on a dead-end road. There was literally nothing down there, except for Robert Schwartz's house. So, the husband asked, what were the teenagers doing down there? Locke left the neighbor's home and checked in by phone with his supervisor to share what he'd just heard about the kids in the mud on Saturday night. And his supervisor was instantly interested because the medical examiner had just come and collected the body, and his initial examination suggested that the murder had happened on Saturday night too. And Locke's supervisor told him that the medical examiner had also discovered something else that was pretty unusual. When he had rolled Robert's body over, he found deep marks in the wood underneath where he had been laying. This was important because it looked like the marks had been made by the knife used to kill Robert. In other words, this could not have just been a regular knife, like you would find in a regular kitchen. Instead, the knife the killer had used had such a long blade that when the killer plunged it into Robert's torso, it had gone all the way through his body and then into the floor beneath him, leaving the marks. That meant the murder weapon had a blade that was at least 2 feet long. Now, the murder weapon had not been found inside of the home, so it looked like the killer had brought the long blade with them to the house and then taken it with them when they left. To Locke and his supervisor, the idea of the murder weapon being this long, strange blade only strengthened their fear that this murder might have a ritualistic or even satanic element to it. But Locke told his supervisor that before they went down a rabbit hole of the occult, they should focus on something a bit simpler that was right in front of their faces. They should track down those teenagers and the tow truck driver. Locke got in his cruiser and drove to the office of the towing company, where he found the owner in the lobby. Locke asked him if he remembered a call on Saturday night about a carload of teenagers stuck in the mud on a dead-end street. As soon as the owner heard this, he scowled. Yeah, he said, I remember. Those kids stiffed my driver on the bill. And now, Locke felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the second suspicious thing he learned about the kids in the stuck car. Not only were they driving down a dead-end road they had no business being on, but they ducked out on the towing bill. Now, stiffing the driver was a crime, but Locke wondered if they had done it because they wanted to avoid giving out their real names. Locke asked the owner if he could speak to the driver, and the owner said sure, then disappeared into the back office. A few minutes later, a man in a t-shirt with the towing company's logo on it walked out into the lobby and said he was the one who helped those kids. Locke could see from the man's furrowed brow and darting eyes that he was nervous, like he had something sensitive or upsetting to say, and Locke wondered if he was about to break this case open right here, right now. The tow truck driver gestured to Locke to follow him to the far corner of the lobby furthest away from the back office where his boss was. When they got there, well out of earshot of the boss, the driver started to mumble something about how he'd gone out in the rain and unstuck the car and the kids jumped in and took off without paying, but then he stopped and looked around like he was making sure they were alone. Once he was satisfied they had real privacy, the driver leaned into Locke and said, "I'll tell you something, but you can't tell my boss." Locke quickly nodded yes, completely desperate for the driver to continue. Whatever he was about to say, Locke wanted to hear it. "Well," the tow truck driver said slowly, "I lied." The tow truck driver explained that the kids did not stiff him on the bill. In fact, they were perfectly nice and polite, and they didn't seem upset in any way, and they had gone to an ATM to get cash to pay the bill. The driver had decided to lie about the kids running off just so he could pocket the cash. And at this, Locke felt himself deflate. He could see his theory of teenagers driving around committing crimes and trying to hide their identities slipping away. Locke suppressed an urge to roll his eyes at the tow truck driver and instead promised he wouldn't say anything to the man's boss. He asked if the driver had the kids' names, and the driver said yes. He kept a log of all his jobs, so he had the driver's name and license number. He also remembered the bank they went to for the ATM. Locke scribbled down the information, thanked the tow truck driver, and then went back to headquarters. Back at his desktop computer, Locke looked up the teenage driver, whose name was Michael Fole. He was hoping to discover that this kid was some kind of serious criminal, but instead, he saw a skinny 21-year-old college student with no record. He made a pretty unlikely murder suspect. Locke leaned back, feeling disappointed. His hope for a simple explanation for the murder, instead of an occult ritual, was fading fast. He checked the time and realized it was now mid-afternoon, and he still hadn't talked to the victim's family yet. He decided he would finish running down the final details on the kids in the car the next day. Right now, he had to go find Robert Schwartz's 3 children and tell them that their father had been murdered. The drive to James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia took about 2 hours, and it was dark by the time Locke pulled onto campus. Both of Robert Schwartz's daughters, his youngest daughter Clara and her older sister Michelle, were students here. And as Locke parked in front of the residence hall, he saw the campus police officer and the university counselor he had contacted to help with the notification waiting for him. They led Locke into the residence hall, up a flight of stairs, and down a hallway to Clara's dorm. The campus police officer knocked and then stepped aside, so Locke could lead the conversation. The door opened, and Locke saw a young girl in baggy clothes with stringy brown hair and red bloodshot eyes. It looked like she'd been awake for days, and he suddenly felt for this teenager, whose life he knew he was about to change completely. He introduced himself and told her he had something important to tell her, but that she should sit down first. He watched as Clara nervously backed up and then sat on the edge of her bed. Then, Locke took a deep breath, and in a quiet and steady voice, he told Clara the news. Her father was dead. For what felt like a very long time, the room was completely silent. Clara stared blankly at Locke, for so long that Locke started to wonder if she'd even understood him. But right before Locke was about to ask her if she was okay, Clara's eyes seemed to snap back into focus, and she finally spoke. She asked how did her dad die. And now, Locke hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He knew he had to be mindful about how much he revealed about the crime, even to the victim's closest family members. Everyone was a possible suspect until they were ruled out. So, Locke told Clara that her father had been found dead inside of his home, and what happened to him was a question they were investigating. Clara went back to staring blankly. Locke could tell Clara was in some kind of shock, and so there was no way he was going to leave her alone. So he asked her to come with him because now they had to go and tell her sister, Michelle. A few minutes later, Locke stood inside of Michelle's dorm room as Michelle screamed the word no over and over again while Clara tried to comfort her. So far, telling the kids had been just as heart-wrenching as Locke had expected. Notifications were one of the hardest parts of his job, especially in a murder, because Locke couldn't just comfort them and leave. Instead, he had to stay and question them, no matter how upset they were. Locke looked at Michelle and Clara, and decided that of the two of them, Clara was in much better shape to be interviewed. So he asked her to please step out of the room so he could ask her a few questions. Clara nodded, and Locke led her out into the hallway to a quiet corner near the stairwell where it felt like they had some privacy. He pulled out his notepad and asked Clara when she last talked to her father. Clara looked down at the floor and shook her head sadly. Friday, she said. They had talked about her coming home for the holidays in a few weeks. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. She said that during that last conversation, she and her father had fought. She had a car, but it was back at the farmhouse, and she wanted to bring it to school, but her dad wouldn't let her. She looked up at Locke and told him that she didn't know why she had gotten so upset at him. Her dad had promised to consider it over the holidays, so she didn't even know why she blew up at him. Now, her final conversation with her father would always be this stupid argument. Locke watched as Clara dropped her head again. He felt sorry for the stunned and awkward teenager. He told Clara he hated to keep pressing, but he needed to know about her father's friends and relationships, and about the people that she and her siblings hung out with. He asked if anyone they knew might have had some kind of grudge against her father. At this, Clara screwed up her face in what looked like deep concentration. Then she slowly listed off the names of some of her dad's closest friends, but said none of them had a grudge, and most of her friends had either never met her dad, or if they had, they really liked him. But then, Locke watched as Clara's expression changed. It looked like she had just remembered something else, and suddenly she looked straight at Locke with a focus in her eyes that he hadn't seen until now. She said one of her friends had recently met her dad over Thanksgiving break, and ever since then, he'd been acting really strange and intense. She told Locke that his name was Kyle Hulbert. He was 18, and they had met at a Renaissance fair a few months earlier. They had gotten along really well at first, but over the last several weeks, his whole demeanor had changed, although she didn't know why. He'd actually gotten busted on a concealed weapons charge for carrying daggers around a shopping mall, and after that, Clara said she had tried to avoid him. At the mention of daggers, Locke's eyes narrowed. This murder case involved an unusual blade as the murder weapon, and while daggers weren't long like the murder weapon, they were an unusual knife to carry, especially at the mall. Locke's disappointment over the teenagers and the tow truck disappeared as he underlined Kyle Hulbert and daggers in his pad. This was a good lead. He told Clara they were almost done, and soon she could go back with her sister and they could tell their brother together. But first, he needed to know the names of Kyle's closest friends. Clara nodded and started listing off names, which Locke wrote down as quickly as he could. But when Clara got to the last name, Locke's pencil froze on the page. Because Locke knew he had heard this name before. Just a few hours earlier, in fact, when he was standing in the tow truck company lobby. It was Michael Foale, the teenage driver of the stuck car. The next day, December 11th, Locke had Michael Foale picked up by police officers when he left his house with his girlfriend in the car. Officers took both of them to the station, put them in separate rooms, and told them to wait. Someone would be in to question them soon. Meanwhile, Locke executed a search warrant at Michael's house, where police seized a desktop computer, 2 black cloaks, multiple knives, a document about human sacrifice, and a sword with a blade more than 2 feet long with little flecks of blood still on the metal. That afternoon, when Locke walked into the interview room where Michael was waiting, he felt like he had a pretty good case. Now, he just needed Michael to talk. And pretty much the second he sat down, Locke got his wish. Michael Foale and his girlfriend agreed to tell Locke everything they knew. But their story was more bizarre and more horrific than Locke or anyone else had expected. In fact, it was so wild and so shocking that it would take several more weeks of investigation before Locke and the rest of the police were able to fully untangle the sequence of events that Michael Foale and his girlfriend sketched out in their interviews that day. But finally, on February 1st, 2002, so almost 2 months after Robert Schwartz's death, the police arrested the mastermind behind the murder. And it was not who the police had expected it to be. Based on interviews, evidence, and transcripts from online and phone conversations, the following is what happened to Dr. Robert Schwartz on the night of Saturday, December 8th, 2001. At around 6:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car driving down a muddy dead-end road in the woods in a rainstorm. The killer's friend, Michael Fole, was driving, and Michael's girlfriend was riding in the front passenger seat. Michael and his girlfriend were both talking because they were trying to find the big old farmhouse that was their destination, but the killer was not paying attention to them. Instead, the killer was completely focused on a different voice, a voice that no one else could hear. The voice was named Nicodemus, and Nicodemus was a god. In fact, Nicodemus was one of 6 gods that had lived inside the killer's head for as long as the killer could remember. And now, Nicodemus had a warning. "Don't go up there," Nicodemus shouted inside of the killer's head. Now, usually, the killer listened to Nicodemus. The killer knew the god was just trying to keep them safe, but tonight, the killer knew they could not back down from their plan. Innocent lives were at stake, because the killer knew something that no one else did, and that was that Dr. Robert Schwartz was a monster. He lashed out with violence even though no one else could see it, and he poisoned lemons and pork with sulfuric acid. And recently, the killer was absolutely certain that Dr. Robert Schwartz had begun planning a murder of his own. The killer knew they had to strike first. So, from the backseat of the car, the killer answered Nicodemus, telling the god in a whisper, "I have to do this." The car came to a stop in the mud in front of Robert Schwartz's farmhouse, and the killer got out wearing a long black trench coat that hid a 27-inch long sword. The killer stalked through the rain up to Robert's front door and started knocking, hard. After a minute, the killer heard footsteps squeaking on old hardwood inside the house, and then the door opened. The killer could smell the dinner that Robert was cooking in the kitchen. Robert stood in the doorway, looking down at the killer in confusion. "Yes?" he asked. The killer asked if Clara was home, and Robert said no. So the killer asked for Clara's phone number, and Robert invited the killer inside out of the rain while he wrote it down. And this was when the killer decided to strike. As Robert stood with his back to the killer, writing out his daughter's phone number, the killer told him, "I know your plans." And as Robert turned in confusion, the killer pulled out the sword and began slashing. Robert tried to protect himself, grabbing for the blade and cutting his hand in the process, spilling blood all over the floor, but the killer was in an unstoppable frenzy. The killer yanked the sword away from Robert and then slashed his stomach. Somehow, Robert stayed standing as the killer swung the sword and sprayed blood across the kitchen. Some of the blood landed in the killer's mouth, and the metallic taste filled the killer with pleasure and adrenaline. The killer slashed Robert over and over until finally Robert fell, landing face down on the hardwood. Robert wasn't moving anymore, and Nicodemus was screaming at the killer to stop, but the killer couldn't stop. Some of Robert's blood had landed on the hot stove, where it was now sizzling, and the smell filled the air as the killer rammed the sword all the way through Robert's body over and over again, sinking the tip of the blade into the hardwood beneath Robert. By the time the killer finished, Robert's clothing was shredded and he had been stabbed more than 30 times. The killer stood over his victim for a minute and then calmly walked over to the stove to turn off the burner. And then before he left the house, as a final touch, the killer took the sword and carved an X into the back of Robert's neck. The killer did this because X was the signature of an assassin in the fantasy game that the killer loved. That fantasy game was called Underworld. Underworld had been created by the killer's best friend, and it was the killer's best friend who was the mastermind behind the murder of Robert Schwartz. In the game of Underworld, the mastermind went by the name High Priestess of Chaos, and the killer was called Assassin. But in the real world, the killer's name was Kyle Hulbert, and the mastermind's name was Clara Schwartz. It would turn out Robert Schwartz's daughter, Clara, had never come out of her depression after the death of her mother. Instead, she sunk deep into misery and also paranoia and became convinced that her father was trying to kill her. And when Clara met Kyle Hulbert at a Renaissance fair, she found a willing player in her dark fantasy world. Kyle was schizophrenic and bipolar, and he'd grown up in foster care and mental hospitals, totally unable to tell the difference between reality and the voices and visions inside of his head. Clara and Kyle, along with Michael Fole and his girlfriend, formed a disturbed little family. They all played characters in Clara's fantasy game, Underworld, and they referred to each other as brother and sister. And over time, Clara had convinced all of them that her father was trying to poison her by lacing lemons and pork with chemicals like sulfuric acid, and that he was ultimately planning to murder her. And so, convinced that Clara was in real danger, Kyle, the Underworld assassin, stepped in to protect her. But what Clara did not say to Kyle was that if her father died, she believed she would inherit several $100,000. And so, at Clara and Kyle's instruction, Michael and his girlfriend drove Kyle to Robert Schwartz's house in the rainstorm on December 8, 2001, so that Kyle could stop Robert once and for all. And they might have gotten away with their crime if their car had not gotten stuck in the mud. In the end, Michael Fohl was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the murder. His girlfriend accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to just 1 year. Kyle pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy and was sentenced to life in prison. And although Clara Schwartz tried to pin the whole murder on Kyle by dropping his name and the story about his arrest for carrying daggers to investigator Locke, she was ultimately caught when police read transcripts of her online and phone conversations with Kyle and her other friends. It was clear that Clara herself was the driving force behind the murder of her father. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to 48 years in prison. In a final twist, it was the DNA research that Dr. Robert Schwartz himself had spent his career on, which helped investigators to determine that the blood on the sword belonged to Robert. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast. We also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Runful. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In June of 1980, a car jolted to a stop in a parking lot on the outskirts of a small Utah suburb. The car door opened, and a man stepped out into the darkness, and he stumbled across the parking lot towards the large building where he worked. He'd been drinking, and he was definitely feeling it. So he stood outside the building for a minute and tried to collect himself. He knew this might be the last moment of peace he or anyone in his community would have in a long time, because he knew something that nobody else inside that building would even imagine. He knew for a fact that someone had just committed the first murder ever recorded in this safe, quiet Utah town. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please set a fake cracked screen wallpaper on the follow button's new phone and watch them panic. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Thursday, June 5th, 1980, 25-year-old Karen Strom pulled her yellow Camaro into the front driveway of her two-story house in Woods Cross, Utah, a small suburb of Salt Lake City. Karen and her husband Steve stepped out and approached the house, which was yellow like the car. And that was not a coincidence. Karen just really loved yellow, and Steve had been more than happy to go along with her when they bought the place. The two of them had just come from dinner, and when they were all dressed up for a night out, some people found it hard to believe that Karen and Steve were just this average couple who lived in a small Utah suburb. Instead, they thought the pair looked more like a Hollywood couple. Karen had long blonde hair and light eyes, and she always looked right at home behind the wheel of her sleek sports car. Steve was tall with red hair and a red beard, and whenever they had their photo taken together, it was like they knew exactly how to pose. However, despite what some people thought about them based on their good looks, those who actually knew Karen and Steve understood that they were just like most young people in the area. They worked hard at their jobs, they talked about starting a family one day, and they loved living in the safe, secluded neighborhood not far from the beautiful Wasatch Mountains. Karen and Steve headed inside the house, and Karen turned on the TV, and then both of them sat down on the couch to watch. But while Karen leaned back and got comfortable, Steve couldn't seem to settle down. They'd gone out to dinner to celebrate both Steve's 27th birthday and also their 7th anniversary. Now, Karen was ready to relax for the rest of the night, but she knew Steve couldn't really do that. Because he still had to go to work that night. He had a late shift at a local factory that went all the way until 7:30 the following morning. So, as Karen sat there, Steve tried to sit for a little while, but then just began getting up and collecting things he would need for work, and then he would come back to the couch, but would be anxious and get up again and get something else that he would need for work. Now, Karen knew that Steve would much rather finish the birthday and anniversary celebration at home with her than go to the factory. But the truth was, Karen actually couldn't wait for Steve to go to work. Because even though she'd gone out with Steve to celebrate and she was now laughing and chatting with him on the couch, in reality, Karen didn't want to even be in the house with her husband anymore, and she'd felt this way for months. Karen and Steve had been high school sweethearts, so they'd been together since they were teenagers. Back in school, Karen had been outgoing and extremely popular, while Steve had always been quiet and a bit shy. But when they met at school, they'd gotten along right away, and they had fallen in love fast. So in 1973, not long after they'd graduated from high school, they got married, and then they moved into a small apartment together and began their lives together. And for a time, the marriage had been everything Karen had dreamed of. She and Steve weren't rich by any means, but they were smart with their money, and they had eventually saved up enough to move out of their first small apartment and buy the yellow house that Karen had loved so much. And back then, the two of them had seemed like partners in everything. They had the same goals, and they truly supported each other. But the longer they stayed together, the more Karen had begun to see a side of Steve that was nothing like the reserved, caring man she fell in love with. Because Steve had begun drinking a lot. In fact, there were some nights when Steve and Karen would go out with a couple they were friends with, and Steve would get so drunk that Karen and the other couple would have to literally carry him out to the car. And then they'd have to carry him from the car to his bed when they got back to the house. But as much as that upset Karen, she didn't even consider those nights to be the worst nights. Because sometimes when Steve drank, he didn't just get sloppy, he got angry and aggressive. And when Karen's sister and friends had started to worry that Steve might be getting violent with her, Karen would defend Steve, saying he was a good guy who just had some bad nights sometimes. But finally, about 3 months before their 7th wedding anniversary, Karen couldn't take Steve's heavy drinking and mood swings anymore, and she'd made what she considered to be the hardest decision of her life. She told Steve that she wanted a divorce, and she'd started spending most nights at her stepmom's house. Even though they were now separated, Karen still went out with Steve sometimes. She still came by the house to see him, and she would even sleep there with him some nights. She knew Steve hoped that meant they could maybe patch things up, but in reality, she just didn't see any hope for their marriage anymore. Back at the house, Karen continued to watch TV, anxiously waiting for the moment when she could be alone and go to sleep by herself in her old bed. And a little after midnight on June 6th, Steve finally said it was time for him to go to work. So, Karen got off the couch, walked with him to the front door, and Steve gave her a kiss. Karen told him to have a good night at work. She said she was going right to bed, and she would see him in the morning when he got home. And once Steve was gone, Karen did head right down the hallway to the bedroom, changed out of her clothes, and climbed into bed. However, she had so many things running through her mind that she couldn't sleep. As upset as she was about Steve's alcohol issues and her crumbling marriage as a result of those issues, this relationship was basically all she'd known since she was a kid. And part of her did still really love Steve. She knew that was why she had not been able to fully walk away yet. But as she lay in bed, Karen felt sure that even if leaving Steve for good would be challenging, it was something she just had to do. And she just had to finally make a clean break and stop staying at this house altogether. She had to start living her own life somewhere else. About 8 hours later, around 7:30 a.m. on June 6, 1980, Steve unlocked the front door of the yellow house, walked inside, and headed right to the bedroom. Steve felt exhausted from his overnight shift, and he couldn't wait to get some sleep. He'd called Karen before he left work, but she hadn't answered, and he'd seen her yellow Camaro still parked out front, so he figured she just hadn't woken up yet. However, when he opened the bedroom door, he froze right there in the doorway. The room was completely trashed. The small TV had been knocked off its stand, one of the bedside tables had been pushed over, and the bed's brass headboard was broken. Then Steve looked down at the floor, and he began to scream, because there, on the ground, sticking out behind the bed, was Karen's feet. Steve ran into the room, hysterical, shouting Karen's name, but when he got to her, he saw that she was totally motionless, just laying there in a t-shirt and her underwear. He crouched down and tried to get her to wake up, but he could tell very quickly that she must be dead. Steve stood up and the room felt like it was spinning. He stumbled outside, made his way to the phone in the kitchen, and dialed 911. Later that morning, Detective Clarence Montgomery of the Woods Cross Police walked towards Karen and Steve's front door. He was responding to a call that had come into the station that said a young woman, Karen Strom, had been found unresponsive inside of her home. As he approached the door, Detective Montgomery saw a uniformed officer standing in the front yard, along with a red-haired man who had his face buried in his hands. Montgomery walked past the red-haired man and the uniformed officer and walked into the house. There, he connected with another uniformed officer who'd arrived first at the scene, who would tell Montgomery that Karen was deceased. And then he led him down the hallway to the bedroom. At the threshold of the bedroom, Montgomery slipped on a pair of gloves. Then he walked inside, and right away he noticed the TV on the floor and the broken bed. Then he walked around the bed and crouched down over Karen's body, and he saw there were deep purple bruises on her neck and throat. And Montgomery just couldn't believe it, because he figured that these bruises were a clear sign that Karen had been murdered, strangled to death. But Woods Cross, Utah, where Montgomery had worked as a cop for a decade, was a very safe and quiet town. And in the 45 years since the town had been founded, there had literally never been a reported homicide. Montgomery stood up and told the other officer to radio in for a forensics team. While Montgomery waited on the forensics team, the other police officer, the one who was first on the scene, radioed the station to have them inform the medical examiner's office about the case, and then that officer left to go contact Karen's family to tell them about her death. So while that was happening, and while Montgomery was just waiting, he just did a complete sweep of the bedroom on his own. Now, despite having never handled a homicide case before, Montgomery knew instinctively that for the room to look like this, to be in complete disarray, could indicate that perhaps a robber was here and had ransacked the place, in addition to, killing Karen. However, after doing the sweep of the bedroom, Montgomery did not come to that conclusion. Instead, he believed someone had come into this bedroom with the sole intent to kill Karen. And the broken bed and the TV on the floor meant one thing. Karen had put up a real fight for her life. So Montgomery went back to Karen's body, and what he saw now seemed to support his theory. The detective found scratches on Karen's arms that looked like defensive wounds, and he also saw that parts of her fingernails had broken off. Not long after Montgomery had fully searched the room, the small forensics team arrived and they did the same thing. And they came to the same conclusion that Montgomery had, that very likely this was a targeted attack on Karen and that Karen had fought back really aggressively. And so they thought that if that was the case, very likely her attacker then had physical marks left on them from Karen. The forensics team dusted the room and the entire house for fingerprints. They also clipped parts of Karen's fingernails and took blood samples from her clothes to save as evidence for possible testing at the crime lab. So in 1980, DNA testing was still in its earliest phase, and it would be years before police departments would use it in investigations. Still, forensic technicians were aware that advances in investigatory technology could happen fast, so they would often collect evidence that they knew they couldn't really test yet, in the hope that maybe at some point in the future, if a crime remained unsolved, new technology and testing would make that evidence viable. As the forensics team continued their work in the house, Detective Montgomery headed outside to speak to the red-haired man he'd seen when he first arrived. The man Montgomery now knew was Karen's husband, Steve. Montgomery could immediately see that Steve was a mess. He was sobbing and looked like he was struggling to catch his breath. Montgomery honestly felt bad for him. However, in a case like this, the spouse was the first suspect. So, after approaching Steve and introducing himself, he began by asking him where he'd been that morning and also where he'd been the night before. Through tears, Steve told Montgomery about his and Karen's dinner, how he'd left her to go to work at the factory around midnight, and that he'd gotten back home around 7:30 that morning. Steve said he'd unlocked the front door, gone right to the bedroom, and found Karen. As Montgomery heard this, he immediately focused on the part where Steve said he unlocked the front door, because Montgomery had not found any evidence of forced entry into the house. But if Steve was telling the truth about the door being locked when he got home, Montgomery thought whoever attacked Karen had to have a key. Or it had to have been someone Karen would open the door for late at night. But before Montgomery could question Steve further, he heard the sound of a car screeching to a halt right outside the house. The detective looked up, saw the car door fly open, and watched as a young woman who was maybe 20 years old marched towards him. And this young woman pointed right at Steve and shouted, "He finally did it! He killed her!" Steve stammered, and Montgomery rushed over to the young woman, trying to keep the situation from getting out of hand. Montgomery tried to calm this young woman down, but it clearly was not working. She said that she was Karen's little sister, Coco, and she'd rushed over as soon as she had gotten the news about her sister's death. And she said again that she was sure Steve had killed her. However, as Montgomery was trying to keep Coco separated from Steve, something happened that made Coco break down even more. The front door of the house opened, and members of the medical examiner's staff wheeled Karen out in a black body bag. And Coco saw it and just crumbled. She started sobbing uncontrollably, and then she told them not to do that, not to take Karen away. Everything about this was new for Detective Montgomery. He'd never dealt with a murder case, and he already felt like the situation at the house was spiraling totally out of control. He knew he needed to act fast before things got worse, so he called an officer over to stay with Karen's sister and to make sure she was okay. He had no idea if there was any truth to the accusations Coco had thrown at Steve, or if it was just how she was dealing with her anger, shock, and grief. But that didn't matter right now. Montgomery marched back across the yard and told Steve they needed to talk down at the station right now. Not long after that, Detective Montgomery led Steve into a small office at the police station. And once they were sitting down, it was clear Steve was still visibly shaken. Montgomery asked him a few basic questions about his and Karen's marriage. He wanted to know if they'd been fighting or had been experiencing any financial problems, anything like that. Steve admitted that he and Karen had hit a rough patch recently, but he said they were working things out. They'd been in love since they were teenagers, and they were both committed to trying to make the marriage work. He said they'd just gone out the night before to celebrate their anniversary, and then Steve said again that after that he'd gone to work right around midnight, and he said everything seemed fine, and that Karen had told him she would see him in the morning. As Steve spoke, Montgomery made a note of Steve's work schedule. Then he asked if there was anyone other than family that Karen might open the door for late at night. Steve nodded and gave Montgomery a list of some of their closest friends. After that, the two men talked for a bit longer, and then eventually Montgomery told Steve he could leave for now. However, the police would soon follow up. After Steve left, Montgomery sat alone for a while, thinking through Steve's story. It'd be easy enough to follow up on his work alibi at the factory, but right now, Montgomery had no idea of Karen's actual time of death. For all he knew, Steve was her killer, and maybe he killed her before he even went to work, and everything he said about discovering Karen's body could just be a complete lie. However, for the time being, he had no evidence pointing directly at Steve, or really anybody else. So, he looked down at the list of friends that Steve had just given him, and he saw one name that might help him verify Steve's alibi and allow him to learn more about Steve and Karen's marriage all at once. The man's name was Ed Owens, and he was Steve's coworker and one of the couple's friends. Late in the afternoon on June 6th, so several hours after Karen's body had been discovered, Detective Montgomery sat down with Ed Owens in an office at a factory in town. Ed sat there in silence for a minute, with a stunned look on his face. He couldn't believe the news Montgomery had just given him about Karen's murder. He said it didn't make sense. People loved Karen. She was beautiful and kind and caring. Montgomery acknowledged that, but he stayed on task, and he asked Ed if he'd seen Steve the night before. Ed told him that they had briefly crossed paths at the factory, but he and Steve had worked different shifts, so they didn't really talk or anything. Then, Montgomery asked about Steve and Karen's relationship. And at this, Ed began to shift a little and got an uncomfortable look on his face. Eventually, he said that he and his wife were good friends with Steve and Karen, and they would go out together, and usually things were great. But sometimes, Steve would drink really heavily to the point where they would have to literally carry him out to the car and even carry him up to his bed on occasion. But Ed was quick to say that despite his alcoholism, Steve loved Karen more than anyone, and that Steve really was a good guy. After Montgomery finished with the interview, he tracked down Steve's manager, who did have a record of Steve clocking in and clocking out at the times he had said. And also, several other employees vouched that Steve had worked the late shift. But again, this didn't really prove anything to Montgomery. He needed to know a time of death to know if Steve showing up for work really was an alibi or not. Like, he could have killed her before he showed up for work. Over the next couple of days, Detective Montgomery and his small investigative team interviewed Karen's friends, family, and coworkers. And a pattern quickly started to emerge. Almost all of them said similar things to what Karen's sister Coco had told police. They had worried about what Steve might do to Karen after he'd been drinking. And some of them said they'd even seen bruises on Karen that clearly she had tried to cover up. This felt like a big discovery to Detective Montgomery. If he could prove that Steve had a history of violence towards his wife, well, he could then connect that to the violent attack that led to Karen's death. And in addition to that, Karen's friends all said something else that also made Steve look bad. They told Montgomery that no matter what Steve said about the marriage, Karen had genuinely been ready to end the marriage. In fact, they told Montgomery that Karen hadn't just brought up divorce and gone to stay with her stepmom. She'd actually started dating somebody else, a car mechanic whose name was Buff Bangetter, and Steve knew all about it. This immediately made Montgomery start to rethink his whole case, or at least it made him consider other possibilities. He'd been so focused on Steve because he believed that Karen's decision to move out of the house could have potentially pushed Steve over the edge and led to him attacking and killing her in a moment of rage. And also, finding out about Karen's new boyfriend could definitely have made Steve even angrier. But now, Montgomery also wondered if the man Karen had started dating, Buff, might have gotten jealous that Karen still spent time and even still spent the night occasionally with her husband Steve. And so maybe if that was the case, Buff could have potentially shown up to the house late at night to confront her. And there was a good chance Karen would have opened the door for him and let him inside. So now it was clear that Montgomery had a potentially angry and jealous husband and a potentially angry and jealous boyfriend. On June 8th, so 2 days after Karen's body had been found in her room, Detective Montgomery sat down with the man Karen had started dating before she died, Buff Bangetter. Buff was cordial and cooperative right from the start. He said he was 35 years old, so about 10 years older than Karen, but he said the age gap really hadn't mattered. He said the two of them had hit it off soon after they had met a couple of months earlier. They both loved cars, and they both dreamed of starting a family someday, and they both desperately wanted to be in a healthy relationship that was built on kindness and mutual respect. Buff also said that he knew all about Karen's relationship with her husband Steve, and he never did anything to stand in the way of it. In fact, he said he didn't have any issue at all with Karen spending time at the house and even staying with Steve overnight. He knew they'd been together a long time and they were still married, so Buff said the last thing he wanted to do was get in the way if there was a chance that maybe Karen and Steve could save their marriage. As Buff said all this, Montgomery got the impression that Buff was truly heartbroken about Karen's death, like he did not come off as if he was lying. Still, that didn't mean he was innocent. After all, Buff's alibi was pretty weak. He said on the night that Karen got murdered, he'd been at home by himself. After their talk, Detective Montgomery let Buff go. He wasn't going to cross Buff off his suspect list by any means, but the interview with Buff didn't do much to change Montgomery's mind about Steve. He believed there were just too many factors that still made Steve the most likely killer. Now, Montgomery just needed some piece of hard evidence that would help him cement that theory. The next day, June 9th, so 3 days into the investigation, Detective Montgomery sat at his desk, reading over the autopsy report that he'd been waiting for. The medical examiner had determined that while there were clear signs of a physical altercation before death, there was no indication of sexual assault. He also stated that the cause of death was indeed strangulation. Now, this did not surprise Montgomery. It had seemed clear to him that Karen had been strangled from the moment he saw her body. But as Montgomery continued to read, he saw there was a note from the medical examiner that made him feel like suddenly everything was falling into place. Because the autopsy report stated that Karen's time of death could have been anywhere between 10 p.m. on June 5th and 2 a.m. on June 6th, which meant that Karen's husband Steve, who did have an alibi for being at work just after midnight, could have, based on timeline, killed her in the couple of hours before he left. And so Detective Montgomery stood up at his desk and sprung into action. He sent officers out to go get Steve and bring him back to the station. Later that afternoon, Montgomery was once again sitting across from Steve. But this time, Steve wasn't crying and trying to catch his breath. Instead, he just had an angry and annoyed look on his face. And Steve didn't waste any time. He told Montgomery that everything he'd said in their first meeting was the truth. Karen had been fine the last time he saw her. He also said he loved his wife and would never hurt her. Then, Steve did something that took Montgomery completely by surprise. Steve leaned in across the table and literally demanded that the police give him a polygraph test right now. Now, even highly cooperative suspects do not volunteer to take polygraphs before the police have even mentioned it. But Montgomery said he'd be happy to accommodate Steve's wishes. So, a little later that afternoon, officers hooked Steve up to the polygraph machine and asked him a series of questions pertaining to his relationship with Karen and to his whereabouts on the night of June 5th and the morning of June 6th. And when the results quickly came back, it showed that Steve had failed. Going over those results, Detective Montgomery was now absolutely convinced Steve was the killer. However, he knew polygraph tests were not admissible evidence in court, so he had to find something more tangible if he wanted to put together a case that the district attorney would be willing to take on. So again, Montgomery had to let Steve go. And this really frustrated him, because Montgomery was feeling an enormous amount of pressure to solve this case. He wanted to get justice for Karen and her family, but he also knew that since this was the first murder case in the community, he was now setting a precedent. And he wanted to prove that the people of Woods Cross could trust their police force to get the job done. Throughout the end of June and all of July, Detective Montgomery and his team dug deep into every aspect of Steve and Karen's lives. The forensics unit had found Steve's fingerprints all over the crime scene, but of course that didn't help Montgomery. It was Steve's house, so it would have actually seemed more incriminating and like Steve had wiped the place clean if none of his prints had been found. So Montgomery and his investigators interviewed and re-interviewed Karen's sister Coco, Steve's co-worker and the couple's friend Ed Owens, and anybody else they could find who was even remotely close to Karen. And during these interviews, talk of Steve's drinking and potentially violent nature towards her kept coming up. Then, Montgomery talked to one of Karen's coworkers who he hadn't spoken to at the beginning of the investigation. And she said that a few months earlier, when Karen had come into work, it was plainly obvious that she had caked layers of makeup onto her neck and throat. But the woman said that despite all that makeup, she could clearly see there were dark bruises on Karen's neck. Seeing these bruises, this coworker had gotten really concerned and had asked Karen what was going on. And she told her that she had gotten the bruises when Steve tried to strangle her. And as soon as Montgomery heard this, he believed he'd finally gotten the break in the case that he needed. As far as he was concerned, this proved not only that Steve had a history of violence, but that he had already strangled his wife at least once. And so Montgomery knew his next step was to secure an arrest warrant for Steve Strom. By August of 1980, so about 2 months after Karen's murder, Steve had been arrested and was being held in custody. And over the next month, as Steve sat in prison, Detective Montgomery believed that he and his team had put together a very strong case and that Steve would soon be found guilty of murder. But in September, Montgomery got a phone call at his desk, and he heard the district attorney's voice on the other line. And the DA said he'd just gotten some really bad news. The judge had ruled that the story Karen's coworker had told about Steve strangling Karen was inadmissible as evidence. The judge had determined that witnesses could only testify on what they'd seen, not just what they'd heard. And Karen's coworker had simply passed on information about Steve strangling Karen that she said Karen had told her. Nobody, including that coworker, had actually seen Steve strangle Karen. As Detective Montgomery listened to the DA, he got a sick feeling in his stomach, and things only got worse. The DA said the issue with the coworker's story had raised concerns about any story from one of Karen's friends or family who said they believed Steve had physically assaulted Karen. Because, like that coworker, all those people had never actually seen the abuse firsthand. Montgomery knew how this conversation was going to end even before it happened, but hearing it out loud still felt like a kick in the gut. Because the DA said he no longer believed they had enough evidence to win in court, and they couldn't risk putting Steve on trial and losing. because if Steve was found not guilty in Karen's murder case, by law, he could never be tried for Karen's murder again. So, for the time being, the case would be dismissed and Steve would be set free. The call from the DA left Detective Montgomery reeling. He knew the forensics team and crime lab had done all they could do at this point. So unless a new eyewitness came out of the woodwork or some new piece of concrete evidence materialized, there was little Montgomery could do to propel the case forward. And as months passed by, nothing new surfaced. And so by early 1981, Karen's murder case had gone cold. Still, Montgomery continued to work the case whenever he had time, and he fielded regular calls from Karen's sister Coco, who desperately wanted updates. But Montgomery never had any news for her. Eventually, Detective Montgomery retired from the force, and at that point, the first reported murder in the history of Woods Cross, Utah, basically disappeared from the public eye. However, decades later, Karen's name would once again dominate the local news. In 2006, over 26 years after Karen's murder, Detective Brad Benson of the Woods Cross Police Department walked into his boss's office. Detective Benson had been a rookie on the force back in 1980 when Karen had gotten murdered. He hadn't been part of the investigation, but he'd never forgotten about the case. Over the past 2.5 decades, Woods Cross had remained a small, quiet suburb with a relatively low crime rate. And so today, Detective Benson found himself in a situation that was pretty common. He had no major criminal cases to work. So he asked his boss if he could take up a cold case, the murder of Karen Strom. His boss stared him down for a second. Like Benson, his boss knew all about the case and the huge impact it had had on the community back in the 1980s. But he wanted to know why, after so many years, Benson thought he could possibly crack the case when nobody else could. And Benson said, well, because technology had advanced leaps and bounds since Karen had gotten killed. And Benson's boss couldn't argue with that, and he said Benson could go work the cold case until another case came his way. After Benson left the office, he didn't necessarily think Karen's murder would suddenly be an open and shut case, but he knew the original investigators had a strong suspect, Karen's husband Steve, but they just could not put enough evidence together that would hold up in court. Benson quickly made his way down a brightly lit set of stairs into a much more dimly lit basement. And once he was there, he looked over shelves stacked with boxes that were filled with evidence from old or forgotten cases. Eventually, he found a box full of evidence from Karen's murder. And when he opened it, he said a silent thank you to Detective Montgomery. Because it was clear to Benson that before Montgomery retired, he had made sure that all of the evidence in that case was securely stored and cataloged in detail. And within days, Benson was able to send 2 major pieces of evidence to the crime lab for testing: clippings of Karen's fingernails and the underwear that she'd been wearing when she was found dead. Now that it was 2006, the lab could run a series of in-depth DNA tests on those pieces of evidence that back in 1980, those tests simply were not possible. Now, Detective Benson knew that since so much time had passed, there was a chance that any potential DNA samples could have become corrupted by now. But he hoped that the care that Detective Montgomery and his team had clearly shown for these pieces of evidence would mean they were still viable for testing. It would take some time for the results to come in, but in early 2007, now 27 years after Karen's murder, Detective Benson was sitting at his desk staring down at a crime lab report, and his hands were literally shaking from excitement. After reading through the whole report, Benson dug through a file folder and found a phone number. Then he grabbed a cell phone and called it. A moment later, a woman in her mid-40s answered. It was Karen's little sister, Coco. And with his voice shaking, Benson told Coco that after all this time, he finally had the evidence police needed to prove who killed her sister. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted off and on over the course of 27 years, this is what police believe happened to Karen when she was murdered in early June of 1980. The killer opened the front door of the house and walked inside. It was dark and quiet, and they slowly made their way down the hall towards the bedroom. When they reached the bedroom, they opened the door. In the moonlight shining through the window, they could see Karen lying in bed. But as the killer stepped into the room, Karen woke up, startled, and she sat upright. The killer then moved towards the bed and said something out loud. Karen could smell the alcohol in their breath and shouted for them to get out. But the killer moved fast. They lunged towards the bed and grabbed Karen by her shoulders. Karen dug her fingernails into the killer's arms and gashed them, and the killer stumbled backwards. Karen leapt out of bed and tried to run for the door, but the killer caught her and grabbed her again. Karen kept fighting. The two of them stumbled through the dark room and slammed into a table, and a small TV crashed to the floor. Karen kept slashing at the killer's arms and face, but she just couldn't break free. The killer pushed her back across the room. They knocked against the bedside table, and the killer threw Karen onto the bed. The killer then leapt on top of her, but she just kept fighting back. Both of them hit against the brass headboard, and the two brass bars just broke. Karen kicked and clawed, and she did get away from the bed again, but this time, the killer grabbed her and slammed her down to the floor. Karen felt the wind knocked out of her, and she couldn't even move, so the killer pinned her down and tried to sexually assault her. But Karen still fought back, and so the killer panicked and just wrapped their hands around her throat and began to squeeze, and Karen choked and gagged and struggled to breathe until she died right there on the floor next to her bed. After that, the killer stood up, stumbled out of the room in a daze, ran down the hall, out of the house, slamming the door behind them. They ran past the yellow Camaro parked in the front driveway and climbed into their own car. Then they hit the gas and sped off into the darkness. It was still dark out, early in the morning. The killer exhaled and relaxed a bit once they were gone. They knew it would be at least a few hours before Steve got home from work. Despite Detective Montgomery, his team, and Coco's wholehearted belief that Karen's husband Steve had killed her, that was not the case. Karen's murderer was also not the man she'd recently begun dating before she died, Buff Bangetter. Instead, the person who had killed her was Steve's co-worker and Karen and Steve's friend, Ed Owens. It would turn out that at some point during their platonic friendship, Ed had decided that he wanted more. He had become sexually attracted to Karen. And on the night of the murder, he'd left work, gone to a bar to have a few drinks, and decided that that was the night he was going to try to have sex with Karen. After all, he knew that Karen was staying at that house and that Steve was going to be out all night working, so Karen was alone. So Ed went to the yellow house and he found the front door was unlocked, which was actually pretty typical for homes in this town. In fact, police were never sure if the door had actually been locked when Steve got home the following morning like he said, or if he just misremembered. And so once Ed was inside the house, he went right to the bedroom and attempted to sexually assault Karen. And in the process, he killed her. Now, police had questioned Ed back in the 1980s, and in the initial interview, Detective Montgomery had noticed scratches on Ed's arms and face. But Ed had told him that he got scratches on him like that all the time from working the machines in the factory. And several of his coworkers backed that claim up. A number of people had also said they saw Ed at a local bar around the time Karen had been killed. But moreover, Montgomery and the police just could not find any clear motive that would lead Ed to kill Karen. But over 2.5 decades later, when Detective Benson took over the cold case, he sent evidence back to the crime lab, and using the latest technology, the lab was able to detect traces of seminal fluid under Karen's fingernails and blood on Karen's underwear. And that indicated to them that the killer had attempted to sexually assault Karen, but she had fought him off, and drawn drops of the killer's blood that landed on her underwear. And both of those DNA samples found on Karen matched Ed Owens. Once Benson had this information, he tracked down Ed Owens, who was 56 years old at the time, and Ed would eventually confess to the murder. Ed was found guilty, and he received a sentence based on Utah's legal statutes from when the crimes had occurred. This meant Ed was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, which had been the maximum sentence back in 1980. He would die in prison in 2021. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.